My wife did not know that the man she was cheating on was actually the shadow investor holding $20 billion of debt against her father company. She thought I was just Alexander, the failed consultant, who drove a rusted pickup truck and wore shirts from Costco. So when she invited me to dinner at Le Bernardin, I knew it was not for a romantic evening. I watched her father Richard slide a manila envelope across the crisp white tablecloth. Inside was a divorce petition and a check for $50,000. He sneered and said, "Take this and disappear. You are embarrassing my daughter." I picked up the check. I did not get angry. I just smiled, because I had just received a text message confirming that my hostile takeover was complete. I was not just losing a wife. I was acquiring her entire world. Before I tell you how I fired my entire family in a single board meeting, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been underestimated by people who should have loved you. Walking into Le Bernardin 20 minutes earlier felt like walking into a lion den armed only with a toothpick. The air smelled of truffle oil and old money. I was wearing my favorite faded jeans and a black polo shirt that cost me $12 at the warehouse store. It was comfortable, practical, and according to the maitre d', an absolute offense to his eyesight. He stepped in front of me with the speed of a cobra, his hand raised in a dismissive stop motion. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his nose wrinkling, as if I smelled of wet dog. "Deliveries are around the back. The kitchen staff entrance is not here." I stood my ground, keeping my voice low and steady. "I am not making a delivery. I am here for a dinner reservation. The Harrington party." The man let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded more like a bark. "The Harrington table is our VIP section. I highly doubt Mr. Richard Harrington is expecting someone who looks like he just finished mowing a lawn. Please leave before I call security to escort you out." I was about to pull out my black card, the one made of titanium that could buy this restaurant 3 times over, but then the heavy oak doors swung open. Richard Harrington walked out. He was wearing a customized Italian suit that cost more than my truck. He looked at the maitre d', then at me, and his eyes gleamed with malicious delight. It was not the look of a father-in-law greeting family. It was the look of a predator finding wounded prey. Henri Richard boomed, his voice echoing in the lobby. "Do not worry. Let him in." The maitre d' looked confused. "But sir, the dress code." Richard waved his hand dismissively, stepping close enough that I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "Rules are for people who matter, Henri. Alexander here is an exception. We need someone to eat the leftovers, do we not? Let him in. Every king needs a fool to laugh at." He patted my shoulder, a heavy, condescending slap that was meant to demean me. "Come along, Alex. Try not to touch anything. We would not want you to stain the furniture with your poverty." I did not brush his hand away. I simply touched the pen in my pocket to ensure the recording light was blinking. That was strike 1. My seat was not even at the table. While Victoria, Richard, and Bradley settled into plush velvet armchairs, the waiter unfolded a creaky wooden chair and jammed it onto the corner. I was positioned directly in the path of the kitchen service door. Every 30 seconds, a server rushed past, with a tray of steaming food, their elbows brushing against the back of my head. I looked at Victoria, hoping for a flicker of indignation, a sign that she respected her husband enough to demand a proper seat. But she was too busy admiring the diamond bracelet on her wrist to notice that I was practically sitting in the aisle. The humiliation was just beginning. The sommelier approached, cradling a leather-bound wine list like a holy scripture. Richard did not even open it. He wanted a show. "Bring us the Chateau Lafite Rothschild 1869, he announced, his voice booming across the quiet dining room. He made sure to pause for effect, waiting for the murmurs of awe from nearby tables. That single bottle cost $15,000. I knew the price not because I could not afford it, but because I had acquired the controlling stake in that vineyard 3 years ago. I was watching my father-in-law order a bottle of wine that I technically sold to him, singing money he had likely embezzled from the company I was about to seize. When the wine arrived, the ceremony was excruciating. Richard tasted it, closed his eyes in theatrical ecstasy, and nodded. He poured a glass for Victoria, their fingers brushing. He poured a glass for Bradley, who toasted him with a smug grin. Then he poured a glass for himself. The bottle still held plenty of the dark crimson liquid. The sommelier moved toward my empty crystal glass, but Richard held up a hand, stopping him mid-motion. "No, do not waste it," Richard said, his tone casual yet cutting. "Alexander would not understand the complexity of a vintage like this. His palate is accustomed to boxed wine and light beer. Pouring this for him would be like casting pearls before swine. He would just gulp it down like soda. Just bring him a glass of tap water. Maybe with some ice if you are feeling generous." Bradley let out a short, cruel laugh. "You are right, Richard. I bet his tongue goes numb if the drink costs more than $10. He turned to me, swirling the $15,000 wine in his glass. "No hard feelings, Alex. We are just trying to save you from a headache. Your system is not built for luxury." I sat there gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. I watched them clink their glasses, the sound ringing like a funeral bell. They were drinking to their wealth, unaware that they were sipping on their own bankruptcy. I took the glass of tap water the waiter slid onto the table without looking at me. I drank it slowly. It tasted like patience, and patience, I reminded myself, was about to pay off in the most violent way possible. Just as I thought the atmosphere could not get any more suffocating, the double doors swung open again. This time it was not a waiter. It was Bradley Pierce, the chief financial officer of Harrington Corporation. If Richard was the bark, Bradley was the bite. He walked with the swagger of a man who thought he owned the sidewalk. But what made my stomach turn was not his arrogance. It was his clothes. Victoria was wearing a distinctive emerald green cocktail dress, a custom shade she had spent weeks selecting. And there was Bradley wearing a silk tie and pocket square in the exact same shade of emerald green. It was not a coincidence. It was a statement. They looked like a matching set. They looked like a couple. He did not even look at me. He walked straight to Richard and exchanged a firm, conspiratorial handshake. Then he turned to my wife. "Hello, beautiful," he said, his voice dripping with synthetic charm. He leaned down and kissed her on the cheek, lingering just a second too long for a platonic colleague. Victoria did not pull away. She leaned into it, her eyes fluttering shut for a brief moment. Then came the physical insult. There was plenty of space on the other side of the table, but Bradley grabbed a heavy dining chair and dragged it loudly across the marble floor. The screech of wood against stone made the other diners flinch. He wedged the chair directly between me and Victoria, forcing me to shift my own seat until I was practically in the walkway. "Move over, sport," he muttered, nudging my shoulder with his elbow. "I need to sit near the decision-makers." I was physically pushed to the very edge of the table, my elbow hanging off into empty space. Bradley sat with his back half-turned to me, effectively cutting me out of the conversation circle, creating a wall of expensive fabric between me and my wife. The waiter arrived with a platter of seared scallops. Victoria clapped her hands in delight. "Oh, Bradley, you have to try this," she squealed, ignoring the fact that I had not even been offered a menu yet. She picked up her silver fork, skewered a scallop, and dipped it in the truffle sauce. Then she did something that made my blood run cold. She held the fork up to his mouth. "Open wide," she cooed. I sat there 3 feet away watching my wife feed another man. She had never fed me. When I cooked dinner at home, she would usually take her plate to the bedroom to watch TV, claiming she had a headache. But here, under the crystal chandeliers, she was performing a mating ritual with the man who was helping her father destroy the company. Bradley chewed with his mouth slightly open, winking at her. "Delicious," he said, licking his lips. "Just like everything else tonight." Richard roared with laughter, slapping the table as if this blatant display of infidelity was the height of comedy. I took a slow breath and looked at Bradley's wrist as he reached for his wine glass. He was wearing a Patek Philippe Nautilus with a blue dial. My eyes narrowed. I knew that watch. I recognized the serial number from the inventory report I had hacked into yesterday. I had personally approved the budget for that specific timepiece 3 months ago, intended as a retirement gift for the company head of logistics. That honest man had been fired last week without benefits to cut costs. And now his retirement gift was sitting on the wrist of the CFO. It was theft, plain and simple. I took a mental photograph. Add embezzlement of corporate assets to the list, I thought. The list of reasons why Bradley Pierce was going to spend the next decade trading cigarettes for protection in a federal prison was getting longer by the minute. As the waiters cleared the untouched scallops from my side of the table, the conversation shifted to the only thing Richard loved more than himself: money. Specifically, the initial public offering of Harrington Corporation, scheduled for 9:30 tomorrow morning. Richard leaned back in his chair, unbuttoning his suit jacket to accommodate his swelling ego. When we ring that bell at the New York Stock Exchange tomorrow morning, Harrington Corp will be valued at $2 billion, he announced, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. We are going to be royalty, Victoria. Real royalty. Not like this peasant you married. Bradley swirled his wine again, looking at me with predatory amusement. It must be hard for you, Alex, sitting here listening to the adults talk about real business. Tell me, how is the freelance consulting gig going? Did you manage to trick another grandmother into letting you fix her Wi-Fi router for $50? He chuckled and looked around the table for approval from my father-in-law. You know, Alex, we are going to need someone to sweep up the confetti after the IPO launch party. I could put in a good word for you with the janitorial staff. It pays minimum wage, but hey, that is a substantial raise for you, right? I kept my face neutral, my eyes fixed on the condensation dripping down my glass of tap water. They had no idea that my consulting firm was actually a private holding company that currently owned the building we were sitting in. But I remained silent, waiting for my wife to speak up. I waited for Victoria to say that I worked hard, that I was honest, that I supported her dreams when she was nobody. Instead, she sighed a long, dramatic exhale of embarrassment. Oh, stop it. Bradley, do not ask him about money. It is depressing. She took a sip of water and looked at her father with pleading eyes. Daddy, you have no idea how embarrassing it is. Alex brings home maybe $2,000 a month on a good month. $2,000. That does not even cover my spa treatments at the Mandarin Oriental. I have to use my corporate credit card just to maintain my appearance because my husband cannot even afford to buy me moisturizer. It is pathetic, really. I feel like I am married to a child who plays office instead of a man who provides. Her words hit me harder than any physical blow. She was talking about the corporate card that I secretly paid off every month using a shell company so she would not be arrested for fraud. She was mocking the income I pretended to have while ignoring the fact that the $2,000 she mentioned was just what I transferred to our joint account to test her frugality. A test she had failed spectacularly every single day for 5 years. I looked at her flawlessly manicured hands, the hands that never washed a dish or lifted a finger, and realized that my charity work was officially over. I was the one who advised the underwriting bank to delay the IPO pricing until the audit was complete. They were bragging about a listing that I had already flagged for fraud investigation 3 hours ago. But I let them talk. Let them build their castle in the clouds, just so the fall would be that much more devastating. I accidentally knocked my linen napkin off my lap. Or maybe it was not an accident at all. Maybe my subconscious simply needed to confirm the sickening reality that my heart already knew. I bent down to retrieve the white cloth from the plush carpet. The tablecloth was long and thick, creating a private, darkened canopy underneath the table. In that shadowed space, the truth was not just visible, it was physical. I saw Bradley polished Italian leather Oxford shoes resting arrogantly on the floor, and wrapped tightly around his calf was Victoria Leg. Her ankle was adorned with a delicate diamond anklet. It was a piece of jewelry I had bought her for our 5th anniversary, using a pseudonym so she would accept it without knowing it came from her poor husband. Now that same anklet was rubbing against the shin of another man. They were not just touching, they were entangled. It was an intimacy that belonged in a bedroom, happening right here beneath the crystal glasses and silver platters, while they discussed stock prices and mocked my existence. I grabbed the napkin and straightened up slowly. The blood rushed to my head, but it was not from the movement. It was pure, cold rage. I placed the napkin back on my lap and looked directly across the table at Victoria. Usually, when a spouse is caught in the act, there is a moment of panic, a flinch, a sudden withdrawal of the guilty limb. But Victoria Harrington was different. As our eyes locked, I saw her pupils dilate. She did not pull her leg away. Instead, I felt the vibration through the floor as she pressed harder against Bradley, her eyes narrowing into a challenge. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her $15,000 wine, holding my gaze over the rim of the crystal glass. It was a silent declaration of war. She was telling me that I was so insignificant, so powerless, that my knowledge of her betrayal did not even matter to her. To her, I was nothing more than a piece of furniture that had developed eyes. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "Alex," she asked, her voice dripping with false concern and heavy sarcasm. "Or are you looking for scraps down there too?" Bradley snickered, unaware that I had seen his foot playing games with my wife. He patted Victoria's hand on the table, oblivious to the silent communication passing between us. I found exactly what I needed. I replied, my voice steady and devoid of the emotion she wanted to see. She smiled, thinking I was defeated. She thought I was lowering my head in shame. She had no idea that in that precise moment I mentally authorized the complete liquidation of her personal trust fund. I had been holding back on the final acquisition order, leaving a small window for mercy, just in case there was a shred of humanity left in her. But that window had just been shattered by a Manolo Blahnik heel. The woman sitting across from me was not my wife anymore. She was a liability. And in my world, liabilities are eliminated with extreme prejudice. The dinner plates were cleared away, leaving only the bitter taste of betrayal in the air. Richard placed his napkin on the table, a signal as precise as a gavel strike in a courtroom. He nodded once at Bradley. The CFO reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, yellow manila envelope. He did not hand it to me. He slid it across the white tablecloth like he was discarding a losing hand of poker. The envelope spun slowly and stopped inches from my chest, knocking against my glass of tap water. "Open it," Richard commanded, leaning back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who believes every problem has a price tag. I undid the metal clasp, my movements slow and deliberate. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a thick stack of legal paperwork titled Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. I glanced at the date. It had been drafted 3 weeks ago. While I was fixing the leaky faucet in Richard's guest house last weekend, they had already printed the paperwork to throw me out. But it was the second piece of paper that made the bile rise in my throat. It was a cashier check made out to Alexander King. The amount was exactly $50,000. I held it up to the light, looking from the check to my wife. Victoria refused to meet my eyes, pretending to be fascinated by the condensation on her wine glass. "Consider that your severance package," Alex Richards said, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "We are calling it compensation for lost youth. You gave Victoria 5 years of your life, and frankly, you dragged her down for every single one of them. But I am a generous man. 50,000 is more money than you would make in 2 years with that pathetic consulting business of yours." He took a sip of his expensive wine and pointed a manicured finger at the check. "Take the money, sign the papers, and disappear tonight. Tomorrow morning, when the opening bell rings on Wall Street and Harrington Corporation goes public, I want a clean image. No dead weight. No embarrassing husband in a pickup truck. I want Victoria standing next to Bradley smiling for the Forbes photographers. I looked at the check again. $50,000. To them, it was a fortune, a life-changing amount that would make a poor man dance. To me, it was less than what I paid for the fuel to fly my Gulfstream to Tokyo. It was an insult so profound that it crossed the line from tragedy into comedy. They were trying to buy off the wolf with a piece of kibble. "Is this it?" I asked, my voice quiet. "This is the price of 5 years of marriage. 10,000 a year." "Do not be greedy," Alex Bradley sneered. "Take it before we change our minds and leave you with nothing." I looked at the check one last time, burning the image into my memory. Then I reached into my pocket for my pen. Not to sign my surrender, but to begin their destruction. The silence at the table was heavy enough to crush a lesser man. Richard was leaning forward, his eyes gleaming with anticipation, already mentally spending the money he thought he just saved by buying me off. Bradley was practically drooling over the prospect of taking my wife home tonight. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a cheap plastic ballpoint pen. It was not a gold fountain pen, like the one Richard used, but it was the instrument that would sign their death warrant. "Make sure you sign legibly, Lex," Richard sneered, his voice low and threatening. "We need this processed by morning so the lawyers can clear the assets before the IPO launch. Do not make this difficult, and maybe I will add another 1,000 for moving expenses." I looked at the divorce papers. The legal jargon blurred into a testament of my wasted years. Then I looked at the check. $50,000. The bribe. The severance package for my marriage. I moved the pen tip toward the signature line on the divorce papers. I saw Victoria release a breath she had been holding. Her shoulders relaxed. She thought she was free. She thought she had won. But then I shifted my hand. I did not sign the papers. I picked up the check. I held it up so the light caught the watermark. Then with slow, deliberate movements, I flipped it over to the blank side. The paper was crisp between my fingers. I pressed down hard with the pen. The ink bled slightly into the fiber of the paper as I wrote in large block letters. REJECTED. Underneath that single word, I wrote one more sentence. "See you in the boardroom." I capped the pen. The click sounded like a gunshot in the quiet dining room. "Here is my answer," I said softly. Bradley was holding his glass of Chateau Lafite near his chest, swirling it arrogantly, savoring the aroma of the fortune he was stealing. He looked at me with mock pity. "What did you write, Alex?" "A thank you note." I did not hand the check to him. I flicked it. It spun through the air and landed perfectly inside the wide rim of his wine glass. Splash! The expensive dark red liquid erupted. It doused his face. It soaked his emerald green tie. And most satisfyingly, it splashed all over his white Italian silk shirt, creating a massive stain that spread across his chest like a gunshot wound. Bradley shrieked, jumping up and knocking his chair over. The sound of shattering glass drew the attention of the entire restaurant. "You idiot! This is a $2,000 shirt! Are you insane?" Richard slammed his hand on the table, his face turning purple with rage. "What the hell is wrong with you? You just ruined a $15,000 bottle of wine." I stood up slowly, buttoning my cheap Costco jacket. I towered over them, my shadow casting a pall over their ruined dinner. "I would worry less about the laundry bill, Bradley," I said, my voice cold enough to freeze the water in the glasses, "and more about the internal audit report regarding the Cayman Island transfers. Enjoy the wine, gentlemen. It is the last expensive thing you will ever taste." I turned and walked away, leaving them covered in wine and confusion. I did not look back. I had an empire to reclaim. The room went completely silent, the kind of silence where you can hear the hum of the air conditioning and the rapid beating of your own heart. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the cold, heavy metal of the Mont Blanc pen that Bradley had slid across the mahogany table. It felt less like a writing instrument and more like a weapon or perhaps the key to a prison cell they were so eager to lock me into. All eyes were glued to my hand. I could feel their collective anticipation, a thick, suffocating weight in the air. My wife, or rather the woman who was about to become my ex-wife, was looking down at her lap, unable to meet my gaze. Her mother was holding her breath, her eyes wide with a mixture of greed and relief. And then there was Bradley, her father, sitting at the head of the table with that smug, triumphant grin plastered across his face. He looked like a hunter who had finally cornered his prey, confident that the check sitting in front of me was the final bullet. $500,000. That was the price they had put on my dignity. That was the number they believed would make me disappear quietly into the night, leaving them to their perfect plastic lives. To them, I was just a poor boy who had stumbled into their golden world, a mistake to be corrected with a bank transfer. They thought I was trembling with fear, but they were wrong. I was trembling with a rage so cold it burned. I brought the pen tip down, hovering just millimeters above the paper. I saw Bradley's shoulders relax. He took a sip of his wine, a $15,000 vintage that cost more than my father made in a year, savoring the taste of his victory. He thought he had won. He thought money was the universal language, the only thing that mattered. But I did not move the pen to the signature line of the divorce papers. Instead, I reached out with my left hand and picked up the check. I held it up to the light for a moment, letting them think I was admiring the zeros. Then, with a swift, deliberate motion, I flipped it over to the blank side. The scratching sound of the pen against the stiff paper was loud in the quiet room. I wrote with broad, aggressive strokes, carving the ink into the fiber. Refused. And below that, 3 simple words. See you tomorrow. I capped the pen with a sharp click that sounded like a gunshot. Slowly, I stood up my chair, scraping against the floor. Bradley frowned, his glass of wine halfway to his mouth, confusion clouding his arrogant features. He started to open his mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, to belittle me one last time. I didn't let him. I looked him dead in the eye, letting him see the fire that had been ignited inside me. Then I flicked my wrist. The check spun through the air like a ninja star and landed perfectly inside the wide rim of his crystal wineglass. The impact was immediate and spectacular. The heavy paper hit the dark red liquid, sending a violent splash erupting upwards and outwards. The wine, dark as blood, sprayed across the pristine white tablecloth and splattered all over Bradley's custom Italian shirt. He gasped, dropping the glass, which shattered on the table, sending more wine cascading onto his lap. The check, now soaked and stained purple, lay amidst the shards of glass, a ruined symbol of their attempted bribery. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the table, looming over the chaos I had just caused. "Keep your money, Bradley," said my voice, low and steady, carrying to every corner of the room. "You are going to need every penny of it to pay the lawyers you will need after what I do next." I turned my back on their shocked gasps and the sight of Bradley frantically dabbing at his ruined shirt. As I walked toward the heavy oak doors, I didn't look back. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking away from a fight. I was walking towards one, and I was going to win. I walked out into the cool night air, letting the heavy oak doors close behind me with a final, satisfying thud. The silence of the parking lot was a welcome relief after the suffocating pretension of the dining room. I loosened my tie, breathing in the scent of asphalt and rain, feeling the adrenaline slowly recede into a cold, hard resolve. The valet, a young kid in a vest that looked too big for him, straightened up when he saw me. His eyes darted to the row of Ferraris and Bentleys, expecting me to hand him a ticket for one of those gleaming beasts. Instead, I walked past him, heading toward the far corner of the lot, to the dark patch where the streetlights didn't quite reach. There she was, my 2005 Ford F-150. To the naked eye, she was a wreck. The paint was peeling, revealing patches of rust like old scars. The bumper was dented from a job site accident years ago, and the left headlight was held in place with duct tape. It was the vehicle of a handyman, a laborer, a nobody. It was the perfect camouflage. I could feel the valet's eyes on my back, probably wondering why a man in a suit was approaching a piece of junk like that. Let him wonder. To them, this truck was a symbol of my failure, the reason I was unworthy of their daughter. They had no idea it was the fortress from which I ruled the world. I pulled the handle. It creaked a sound I had intentionally left unfixed. I climbed into the cab, the smell of old leather and stale coffee greeting me like an old friend. I sat there for a moment in the darkness, gripping the worn steering wheel. I took a deep breath, centering myself. The anger from the dinner table was still there, but now it was focused a laser instead of a wildfire. I reached under the dashboard, my fingers finding the hidden biometric scanner that was seamlessly integrated into the plastic molding. It was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. I pressed my thumb against the cold sensor. A soft hum filled the cabin, barely audible, like the purr of a sleeping cat waking up. The interior shifted. The worn-out analog dashboard with its cracked plastic and stuck needles suddenly went dark. Then it dissolved. The entire instrument panel was a high-definition holographic projection that flickered and restabilized into a sleek, dark interface. The old radio display slid back, revealing a wide, curved satellite monitor that glowed with a crisp blue light. Streams of data began to cascade down the screens. Global markets, real estate acquisitions in Tokyo and London, live feeds from my tech manufacturing plants in Shenzhen. The rusty old truck was now more advanced than the Situation Room at the Pentagon. I wasn't just a driver anymore. I was the operator of a global network that moved mountains while the world slept. A mechanical voice, cool and synthetic, broke the silence. "Welcome back, sir." Identity confirmed. Accessing primary accounts. I watched as the central screen cleared a single line of text appearing in the center. It wasn't just a number. It was the score of a game I had been winning for a decade while everyone else thought I wasn't even playing. The digits scrolled rapidly, tallying the day's closing numbers from the Asian markets. Finally, the figure settled, glowing in stark white against the black background. Net worth $45 billion. I looked at the number. Then I thought about the $500,000 check currently dissolving in a glass of wine inside the building. It was a rounding error. It was pocket change. It was an insult not because it was too little, but because they thought it was enough to buy a man who could buy their entire lineage 10 times over without blinking. I tapped the screen, dismissing the balance. I didn't need to stare at it. I knew what I was worth. Now it was time to show them. I put the truck into gear, the engine shifting from a rough idle to a precision hum that betrayed the high-performance beast hidden beneath the rusted hood. I pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the luxury cars in my rearview mirror, driving toward a tomorrow where the masks would finally come off. The tires hummed a low, aggressive note against the asphalt as I merged onto the highway, the city lights blurring into streaks of neon gold and red in my peripheral vision. Inside the cab of the truck, the atmosphere was sterile and cold, illuminated only by the ghostly blue wash of the holographic displays. I wasn't just driving a vehicle anymore. I was sitting in the command center of a war room, and the enemy had no idea the missiles were already in the air. I tapped the secure comms icon on the floating interface. The connection encrypted, instantly routing through 3 different continents before finding its target. The ringtone pulsed once, twice, and then the crisp, alert voice of my chief counsel filled the cabin. "Blackwood here." It was 3 in the morning where he was, but he sounded as sharp as a razor blade. He knew that if I was calling on this line at this hour, the world was about to shift on its axis. "It is time," I said, my voice steady, stripped of the emotion that had nearly choked me back at the dinner table. "Initiate Project Kraken." There was a heavy pause on the other end. I could practically hear him straightening his tie, his mind racing through the files we had prepared for this exact scenario. Project Kraken wasn't a business strategy. It was a nuclear option. It was a contingency plan designed for total domination, a way to seize control so absolute that resistance would be mathematically impossible. Sir Blackwood said, his tone cautious. To execute Kraken tonight, we are dealing with the outstanding float. That final 2% is held by the Greybridge Fund. They have been holding out for months. They know we want it. If we move now in the middle of the night, they will smell blood. They will squeeze us. Let them squeeze, I replied, watching the digital speedometer climb as I accelerated into the fast lane. I am done negotiating. I am done playing the long game. Call them, wake them up, get the fund manager out of bed if you have to. Sir, the price, Blackwood warned. To get them to sign over that block before the market opens, we will have to pay a premium that borders on insanity. Offer them double, I cut him off. The silence on the line was profound. Double Blackwood repeated his professional mask, slipping for a fraction of a second. Sir, that is double the all-time high. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars for a minority stake. It is unprecedented. I don't care about the price, Blackwood. I said, my grip tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I don't care if it costs $1 billion. I don't want a negotiation. I want a surrender. I want that 2% transferred and ratified within the hour. I glanced at the monitor where the company's shareholder structure was displayed in a complex pie chart. A massive slice was already mine, hidden under shell companies and blind trusts. But it wasn't enough. I needed that sliver. That 2% was the difference between influence and absolute power. It was the key to the veto. With 51%, Blackwood said, his voice dropping as the realization hit him, you will have veto power over the board. You can block the merger Bradley has been working on for 2 years. You can freeze their assets. You can fire the entire executive suite. Exactly, I whispered, a dark satisfaction curling in my chest. Bradley thinks he is the king of his little castle. He thinks he can throw me crumbs and watch me dance. Tomorrow morning he is going to wake up and realize he doesn't even own the chair he is sitting in. Do it, I commanded. Buy it all. Burn the cash. Secure the veto. Understood, Sir Blackwood said, his voice snapping back to military precision. Initiating acquisition now. The line went dead. On the screen, a new window popped up tracking the acquisition in real time. I watched the status bars flicker from pending to processing. I wasn't just buying stock. I was buying the look on Bradley's face when he realized that the man he had tried to bribe with a check was the same man who had just bought his entire life. The engine roared as I sped into the night, leaving the old me in the dust, racing toward a dawn that would belong entirely to me. As I drove through the empty streets, the hum of the engine faded into the background, and my mind drifted back 5 years to a rainy Tuesday afternoon in Seattle. It was the day I met her. The memory used to be warm, a source of comfort. I would wrap around myself when the nights got cold, but now it felt like watching a crime scene video, looking for the exact moment the killer slipped the poison into the drink. I was sitting in a corner booth of a small coffee shop, trying to salvage a merger that was falling apart. I was stressed, my tie undone, my hair a mess. I must have looked like a man on the edge of a breakdown. That was when Victoria appeared. She didn't look like the ice queen she was tonight. She was wearing a simple raincoat, her hair damp and messy, and she held a book of poetry in her hand. She bumped into my table, spilling a little bit of her tea on my papers. I remember her apology. It was frantic and sweet. She grabbed napkins, dabbing at the wet spots on the documents. I told her it was fine, that it was just business. And that was when she looked at me with those wide, innocent eyes and said the words that hooked me. She said she hated business. She said she hated how money made people so serious and sad. She told me she was looking for something real, something simple. For a man who spent his life surrounded by sharks who wanted a piece of my fortune, she was a breath of fresh air. I thought I had found the one person who didn't care about the balance in my bank account. I thought she saw the man behind the desk. But as I gripped the steering wheel of the truck, the pieces finally clicked together. I wasn't just some random guy in a coffee shop. The papers on the table that day weren't just any papers. They were the preliminary prospectus for the Omnicorp acquisition. The logo was visible. The valuation was visible. Victoria hadn't bumped into me by accident. She had spotted the whale. She had recognized the merger that was all over the financial news. She knew exactly who I was before she ever spilled that tea. She played the role of the starving artist perfectly. The woman who shopped at thrift stores and dreamed of a small cottage. But the cracks started to show 6 months later. It was the day the news broke about my solar energy subsidiary filing for bankruptcy. To me, it was a strategic tax write-off, a calculated loss to free up capital for something bigger. But to the outside world, it looked like a disaster. I remember coming home that night. I expected comfort. Instead, I found a coldness in her eyes that I had never seen before. She asked me if we were going to be poor. I tested her. I told her things were going to be tight. I told her I might lose the penthouse. I wanted to see if she would stand by me. That was the moment the love died for her. She didn't leave immediately, because she had already invested time in me. She stayed, but the warmth vanished. She started treating me like a failure, like a man who had tricked her into a life of mediocrity. She thought she had trapped a billionaire, but believed she had ended up with a bankrupt loser. She spent the last 4 years punishing me for her own mistake. She hated me not because I was poor, but because she thought I had lost the fortune she felt entitled to. She had no idea that while she was despising me for being broke, I was quietly tripling my net worth in the shadows. The joke was on her, but it was a joke that had cost me 5 years of my life. The rain began to hammer against the windshield of the truck, blurring the city lights into a kaleidoscope of neon and shadow as my mind drifted further back into the past. I wasn't just thinking about Victoria anymore. My thoughts had shifted to the man who sat at the head of the table tonight, swirling his expensive wine and looking at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. Bradley Harrington, the self-proclaimed titan of industry. The man who lectured me on ambition and success while I sat in silence. But I remembered a different Bradley. I remembered the man from 3 years ago sitting in that same dining room, his face the color of wet ash, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't even hold his fork. Back then, the Harrington Group wasn't a titan. It was a rotting carcass. They had leveraged themselves into oblivion, betting the family fortune on a lithium deal that imploded overnight. The creditors were circling like sharks in bloody water. They were 48 hours away from liquidation. I remember sitting there listening to him weep into his scotch, listening to him terrify Victoria with stories of losing the estate, the summer homes, the status. He was a broken man staring into the abyss of the poverty he despised so much in others. He was pathetic. I should have let him fall. I should have let the market do its work and watched the house of cards collapse. But I was foolish. I was blinded by what I thought was love. I couldn't bear to see the fear in Victoria's eyes. I wanted to be the hero even if nobody knew I was wearing the cape. So I excused myself from the table, went into the guest bathroom, and made a single encrypted call to Blackwood. I didn't hand over a check. That would have ended the charade. Instead, I executed a complex financial maneuver that would have made a central banker dizzy. I routed the capital through a labyrinth of shell companies and blind trusts based in Singapore and the Cayman Islands. I mobilized the Aurora Fund. I poured $20 billion of hard liquidity into their accounts overnight. It was an anonymous injection, a miracle from the financial heavens that nobody could trace back to the guy driving the beat-up Ford truck. I remember the next morning vividly. Bradley ran into the kitchen, waving his phone, screaming that they were saved. He claimed it was his brilliance, his reputation, that had attracted a mystery consortium. He stood there puffed up like a peacock and lectured me on the importance of tenacity and business acumen. He told me I should take notes on how a real man handles a crisis. I sat there eating my toast, knowing that the only reason he wasn't standing in a breadline was because I had decided to be merciful. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the leather groan under my hands. The irony was so sharp it tasted like copper in my mouth. I had saved them. I had pulled them from the fire. And what had they done with that second chance? They had used the very wealth I gifted them to build a pedestal so high they couldn't even see me anymore. They used my money to buy the wine they threw in my face. They used my capital to fund the lawyers they threatened me with. The check Bradley tried to buy me off with was essentially my own money cycled back to me as an insult. I hadn't just saved a company. I had nurtured a nest of vipers. I had fed them, kept them warm, and strengthened them until they were big enough to bite the hand that fed them. That $20 billion wasn't an investment. It was the price of a lesson I would never forget. They thought that money made them powerful. They didn't realize that the man who can give $20 billion in silence is the same man who can take it all away without whispering a word. They were celebrating their survival, not knowing that they were living on borrowed time, and the lender had finally come to collect. The silence inside the truck was broken by a sharp, urgent chime that cut through the darkness like a warning siren. A crimson notification pulse on the main holographic display, casting a blood-red glow over my hands as they rested on the steering wheel. It was a Priority 1 transmission from Blackwood. The subject line was encrypted, but the metadata tag was simple and chilling. It read, "The Smoking Gun." I exhaled slowly, watching my breath fog in the cool air conditioning, and tapped the screen to decrypt the file. The data stream unfolded instantly, a waterfall of spreadsheets, bank routing numbers, and wire transfer confirmations cascading down the curved monitor. It was the forensic accounting report I had ordered Blackwood to compile weeks ago, a deep dive into the Harrington Group's internal finances that bypassed their cooked books and went straight to the raw server logs. I began to scroll my eyes, scanning the columns of numbers with the practiced speed of a man who sees the world in digits. At first, it looked like standard corporate mismanagement. Bloated executive bonuses, excessive travel expenses, bleeding subsidiaries. It was incompetence, but it wasn't criminal. Then I saw it. It was buried deep in the subledger for the third quarter of last year, hidden under a generic label marked Operational Restructuring Costs, a transfer. A massive singular hemorrhage of capital. $200 million moved in a single transaction. I swiped the data to the center screen, expanding the transaction details. I traced the routing path. The money hadn't gone to a vendor. It hadn't gone to a creditor. It had been wired through a shell company in Panama and then deposited directly into a numbered private account at the Sovereign Bank of Zurich. The beneficiary wasn't a corporation. It was a personal entity, and the digital signature authorizing the transfer belonged to one man, Bradley Harrington. But the destination wasn't the worst part. It was the source. I backtracked the funds following the digital trail up the stream to see where that $200 million had come from. When the source account finally flashed on the screen, I felt a physical wave of nausea roll through me. It wasn't company profit. It wasn't the liquidity injection I had anonymously provided. It was the employee pension trust. I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening until my teeth ached. Bradley hadn't just embezzled money. He had raided the retirement savings of 5,000 employees. He had stolen the futures of the janitors who cleaned his floors, the assembly line workers who built his products, and the secretaries who covered for his mistakes. He had siphoned the life savings of people who lived paycheck to paycheck just so he could maintain his facade of aristocracy. The wine he had spilled on the table tonight, the yacht he bragged about, the jewelry Victoria wore. It wasn't paid for by business acumen. It was paid for by the stolen security of honest people. He wasn't just a failed businessman or a terrible father-in-law. He was a predator. He was a parasite feeding on the very people he claimed to lead. I looked at the digital readout of the Swiss account balance. It was sitting there untouched, accruing interest while he laid off workers and cut benefits claiming times were tough. He had looked me in the eye and called me unworthy while he had the moral backbone of a thief. This changed everything. This wasn't just a corporate takeover anymore. This wasn't just about humiliating him in the boardroom or taking his chair. This was a crime. A federal offense that carried a sentence measured in decades, not years. I wasn't just holding a veto power. I was holding the key to his prison cell. I reached for the secure phone line again. The anger I felt now was different from the rage at the dinner table. That had been personal. This was righteous. I was going to take everything from him, and then I was going to hand him over to the authorities in handcuffs. The game was over. The hunt had begun. The first gray light of dawn was bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my private sanctuary high above the sleeping city. It was a cold, unforgiving light that matched the temperature in my veins perfectly. I stood in the center of the dressing room, a space larger than the entire apartment I had shared with Victoria, surrounded by the silent testament to the life I had kept hidden for so long. It was time to shed the final layer of the chrysalis. It was time to dress for war. I walked to the center rack and unzipped the garment bag. The sound was a sharp hiss in the quiet room. Inside hung the bespoke Tom Ford suit, charcoal gray, with a subtle pinstripe tailored to within a millimeter of my frame. I ran my hand over the fabric. It was exquisite, cool to the touch, and woven from the finest wool money could buy. This wasn't just clothing. It was armor. It was the uniform of a general stepping onto the battlefield. I slipped into the trousers, feeling the silk lining against my skin. Then the shirt, crisp and white, starched to perfection. I buttoned it slowly, starting from the bottom, and working my way up, sealing myself in. I tied the tie a deep midnight blue, creating a knot that was mathematically perfect, a sharp triangle of silk that sat precisely at my throat. Finally, I shrugged on the jacket. It settled onto my shoulders with a reassuring weight, instantly transforming my silhouette. The slouch of the beaten-down son-in-law vanished, replaced by the broad, imposing lines of a titan. I turned to the marble island in the center of the room. Lying on a velvet tray was the final piece, the Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime, $2 million of gold and complex mechanics. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a machine that measured time with a heartbeat of its own. I picked it up, the metal heavy and cold in my palm. I fastened the strap around my wrist. The click of the clasp sounded like the loading of a weapon. I wasn't just wearing a watch. I was wearing a statement. I was wearing the power to buy and sell their entire existence without checking my balance. I walked over to the full-length mirror that stood in the corner. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the reflection that stared back. The man in the glass was familiar, yet utterly a stranger to the life I had lived for the past 5 years. The soft, apologetic curve of the mouth was gone, replaced by a hard, thin line. The posture was rigid, predatory. But it was the eyes that held the real truth. Gone was the warmth, the patience, the desperate need for approval that had defined Alex the husband. In their place burned a cold blue fire. It was the gaze of a shark scenting blood in the water. It was the look of the Wolf of Wall Street. I leaned closer to the glass, studying the transformation. I didn't see a victim. I didn't see a martyr. I saw the executioner. The man who had sat at Bradley's table and swallowed his insults was dead. He had died the moment that check hit the wine glass. The man standing here now was the one who controlled the boardrooms, who moved markets with a whisper, who held the fate of the Harrington family in the palm of his hand. I adjusted my cuffs one last time, a small, precise movement. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of expensive cologne and impending victory. The sun had fully risen now, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. The city was waking up, unaware that a storm was about to break. I turned away from the mirror, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. It was time to go to work. It was time to end this. The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom were closed, sealing in an atmosphere of thick, suffocating self-congratulation. Inside, the air smelled of expensive leather and the crisp, yeasty scent of vintage champagne. The pop of the cork was loud, echoing off the glass walls like a starting pistol for a race they thought they had already won. Bradley stood at the head of the long conference table, the crystal bottle in his hand, foam spilling over his fingers. He didn't even bother to wipe it up. He just laughed, a deep, throaty sound that vibrated with the arrogance of a man who believes he is untouchable. Richard was right beside him, holding out a flute with a trembling, eager hand. He looked like a dog waiting for a scrap from the master's table. They were toasting to the death of the company. The papers were stacked in the center of the table, ready for signatures. The sale to their biggest competitor was all but finalized. It was a fire sale, a liquidation of the legacy I had secretly saved, but to them it was a golden parachute. They were cashing out, leaving the carcass for the vultures, and walking away with pockets full of silver. But the most grotesque sight wasn't the two men congratulating themselves on their betrayal. It was Victoria. She was sitting in the chairman's seat at the very head of the table. It was the seat reserved for the majority shareholder, a throne she had absolutely no right to occupy. She spun the chair, slowly testing the weight of it, a smile of pure vanity playing on her lips. She looked like a child playing dress-up in a king's court, completely unaware of the gravity of the position she was mocking. She extended her hand, catching the morning light that streamed through the windows. On her ring finger sat a diamond the size of a quail's egg. It was massive, vulgar, and brilliant. The facets caught the sun and threw rainbows across the polished wood of the table. She admired it, twisting her hand this way and that, mesmerized by the shine. "Look at the clarity," she purred, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Daddy, you really outdid yourself this time. It is perfect." Bradley beamed at her, his chest puffing out. "Only the best for my little girl," he said, pouring champagne into her glass. "We are about to be very, very rich, sweetheart. You deserve to look the part." I watched the scene in my mind's eye, knowing exactly what that stone represented. It wasn't a gift of love. It wasn't a reward for hard work. That diamond didn't sparkle with carbon and light. It sparkled with the stolen futures of 5,000 pensioners. It was cut from the fear of the assembly line workers who would lose their homes. It was polished with the tears of retirees who would wake up to empty bank accounts. She held the glass of champagne, the bubbles rising around the diamond, creating a kaleidoscope of greed. She laughed, a tinkling, carefree sound that grated against the reality of the crime. She had no idea she was wearing evidence. She had no idea that the ring she was so proud of was the final nail in her father's coffin. She sat there, queen of the ashes, toasting to a victory that was actually a felony. The arrogance was blinding. They truly believed the world was theirs for the taking, that consequences were things that happened to other people, to the little people. They had no idea that the elevator was ascending, bringing with it the storm that would wash away their smiles, their champagne, and their stolen diamonds forever. The heavy double doors didn't just open, they exploded inward, slamming against the mahogany paneling with a violence that shook the room. The sound was like a gunshot, instantly silencing the laughter and the clinking of crystal. The air in the room changed in a microsecond, shifting from the warm haze of celebration to the freezing vacuum of deep space. I stepped across the threshold, my heels striking the marble floor with the rhythmic authority of a ticking clock counting down to 0. I wasn't alone. Flanking me was a phalanx of 10 men. 5 were security, massive figures cut from granite, moving with the silent, lethal grace of apex predators. The other 5 were legal counsel led by Blackwood, who marched in step with me, clutching briefcases that contained enough ammunition to level a small nation. We moved as a single entity, a dark wave of power rolling into their sanctuary. The tableau before me froze. Victoria's hand was still raised, the champagne flute halfway to her lips, the diamond catching the light. Bradley stood with his mouth open, the arrogance draining out of his face like water from a cracked glass. But it was Richard who broke the silence. He jumped to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor, his face flushing a deep, ugly crimson. He looked at me, then at the men behind me, and his mind snapped. He couldn't process the image. He was still stuck in the old reality where I was the punching bag, the pauper, the nobody. "Security!" he screamed, his voice cracking high and shrill, a desperate sound that bounced off the glass walls. "Where the hell is security? Get in here! Get in here right now! Throw this bum out! Throw this filth out of my building!" He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes bulging with impotent rage. He expected the universe to obey him. He expected the uniformed guards stationed by the door to rush forward, grab me by the collar, and drag me away so they could go back to their toast. He waited for the violence that had always protected men like him from men like me. But the room remained still. The two security guards posted at the entrance, big men hired for their size and their ability to intimidate, didn't move a muscle. They looked at Richard screaming orders. Then they looked at Mima. They saw the Tom Ford suit. They saw the Patek Philippe on my wrist. But more than that, they saw the way I held myself. They saw the cold, absolute certainty in my eyes. They were creatures of instinct, and their survival instinct was screaming at them. They recognized the aura of a man who doesn't just sign paychecks, but owns the ink they are printed with. They felt the shift in gravity. One of the guards actually lowered his gaze, stepping back and clasping his hands behind his back in a gesture of deference. They wouldn't touch me. They wouldn't dare. Richard looked at them, his confusion morphing into terror. "Do you hear me?" he shrieked, slamming his fist onto the polished wood. "I gave you an order. Remove him immediately." I stopped 5 feet from the table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I let the silence stretch out tight as a piano wire until the only sound was Richard's ragged breathing. I adjusted my cufflink, a slow, deliberate movement that drew every eye in the room. "Sit down, Richard," I said. My voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried across the room with the weight of a gavel strike. "You are embarrassing yourself. And nobody gives orders in my boardroom except me." The words hit them like a physical blow. Victoria dropped her glass. It shattered on the table, sending champagne and shards of crystal skittering across the surface, but no one flinched. They were too busy staring at the man they thought they knew, realizing with dawning horror that they were locked in a cage with a wolf, and the door had just been bolted shut. I did not stop walking until I was standing directly beside the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table. Victoria sat there frozen like a statue carved from ice and panic. Her hands were gripping the armrests so tightly that her knuckles were white against the dark wood. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and searching, darting between my face and the silent, imposing figures of my security detail. She was waiting for the punchline. She was waiting for me to crack a smile and apologize for the intrusion. She was waiting for the Alex she knew, the Alex she had broken, to reappear and beg for forgiveness. But that Alex was gone. The man standing over her was a stranger in a suit that cost more than the annual salary of the people her father had robbed. I didn't look down at her. I kept my gaze fixed on the skyline visible through the glass walls behind her, a sprawling view of a city that was now part of my domain. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy and suffocating. I could hear the shallow, terrified rhythm of her breathing. I could smell the expensive perfume she wore, the scent that used to make my heart race but now just smelled like deception. I didn't speak. I didn't scream. I didn't demand she move. I simply raised my right hand. I didn't point. I didn't wave. I extended 2 fingers and made a small, sharp, flicking motion upwards. It was a gesture of dismissal. It was the kind of signal you would give to a waiter to clear a table or to a dog that had jumped onto a piece of furniture where it didn't belong. It was casual, arrogant, and devastatingly insulting. Victoria blinked, confusion warring with indignation on her face. She opened her mouth to speak, to protest, to assert her imaginary authority, but the words died in her throat. She looked at my hand suspended in the air, then at my face, which was as hard and unyielding as granite. She didn't move. She couldn't process that her reign, which she thought had just begun, was already over. Then Blackwood stepped forward from my right side. He moved with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of an executioner. He didn't look at Victoria with anger. He looked at her with pity. He placed a single leather-bound document on the polished table, sliding it forward until it rested just inches from her diamond ring. "Mrs. Harrington Blackwood," said his voice smooth and carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding regarding the seating arrangements for this meeting." Victoria found her voice at last, though it was thin and brittle. "Excuse me," she stammered, her eyes flashing with a desperate spark of defiance. "This is my father's company. This is the chairman's seat. I am the future of this board." Blackwood didn't even blink. He tapped the document on the table with his index finger. "Correction, madam," he said, his tone dropping to a level of seriousness that made the air in the room drop 10 degrees. "This was your father's company. However, as of 4 o'clock this morning, following the acquisition of the outstanding Greybridge block and the execution of the Kraken protocols, the equity structure of this corporation has been fundamentally altered." He leaned in slightly, looking her dead in the eye. "You are currently occupying the seat designated for the majority shareholder, and unless you have 53% of the voting stock hidden in that purse, you are sitting in my client's chair." The number hung in the air like a guillotine blade. 53%. Victoria's face went white. She looked at the document, then at her father, who was slumped in his chair, clutching his chest, his face gray with shock. The reality hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't the queen. She was a trespasser. "Move," I whispered. It was the only word I spoke. It broke the spell. Victoria scrambled out of the chair as if it were on fire. She tripped over her own heels, stumbling backward, clutching the edge of the table for support. She retreated to the wall, her eyes wide with humiliation. I smoothed the front of my jacket. I stepped forward and turned. I sat down. The leather groaned softly, accepting its new master. I placed my hands on the table right over the merger documents they had been about to sign. I looked down the long expanse of mahogany at the people who had tried to destroy me, and I finally let myself smile. The silence that followed my declaration did not last long because it was shattered by a sound that was both jarring and completely unexpected. Richard started to laugh. It began as a low rumble in his chest, a dry hacking sound that quickly escalated into a high-pitched cackle that echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom. He threw his head back, clutching his stomach. Tears of mirth streaming down his flushed cheeks. It was the laughter of a man whose mind had simply refused to accept the new reality presented to him. It was a rejection of the truth so violent it bordered on madness. He slammed his hand onto the table, making the champagne glasses jump. "Oh, this is rich," he wheezed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "This is absolutely priceless. For a second there, Alex, I actually thought you were serious. I almost believed you. You really went all out on this little charade, didn't you?" He reached out and snatched the leather-bound document that Blackwood had placed on the table. He didn't read it. He didn't even look at the seal or the signatures. He just flipped it open and waved it in the air like a meaningless prop. "Look at this," he shouted to the room, looking around for validation. "Look at the effort he put into these forgeries. It is pathetic. You probably printed these off a home computer in that rusted truck of yours. 53%. You do not own 53 cents, Alex. You are a broke, delusional nobody who watched too many movies and decided to play dress-up." Bradley seemed uncertain, his eyes darting between me and the paperwork, but Richard was running on pure adrenaline and denial. He was convinced that the world worked a certain way, that men like him were always on top, and men like me were always on the bottom. The idea that the natural order had flipped was simply impossible to him. Therefore, the documents had to be fake. The suit had to be a rental. The watch had to be a replica. "I am ending this farce right now," Richard announced, his voice dripping with venom. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers fumbling over the screen as he unlocked it. He didn't call security this time. He went straight to the authorities. He dialed 3 digits and held the phone to his ear, staring at me with a triumphant sneer. "Yes, I need the police immediately," he barked into the receiver, his voice loud and performative. "I am at the Harrington Tower penthouse boardroom. We have a trespasser. He is mentally unstable, and he has broken into a private meeting with a group of armed thugs. Yes, he is refusing to leave. He is creating a disturbance. I want him arrested. I want him in handcuffs." He listened for a moment, nodding aggressively. "Yes, we will wait. Send everything you have. This man is dangerous." He ended the call and slammed the phone down on the table right next to the merger papers. "There," he said, smoothing his tie and puffing out his chest. "You hear that, Alex? The real world is coming for you. You have about 5 minutes to enjoy playing king in that chair before men with guns come through those doors and drag you out by your hair. You think you can walk in here with fake papers and intimidate us. You are going to rot in a cell for fraud and disturbing the peace." I watched him rant and rave, observing him with the detached curiosity of a scientist, studying a specimen under a microscope. He truly believed he had won. He thought the police were his personal enforcement squad. He didn't realize that when the authorities arrived, they wouldn't be looking at the man sitting calmly in the chairman's seat. They would be looking for the man whose name was on the unauthorized wire transfer to Switzerland. Richard thought he had called for my execution, but in reality, he had just expedited his own funeral. I didn't say a word. I just steepled my fingers and waited for the sirens. The waiting game inside the boardroom was suffocating, a tense purgatory that Richard filled with nervous, frantic energy. He paced the length of the room, checking his watch every 30 seconds, his heels clicking a rhythmic beat of impatience against the marble floor. He was rehearsing the speech he would give to the police, muttering under his breath about trespassing and harassment, building a fortress of denial to protect his crumbling reality. He was so certain the sirens were coming to save him that he didn't notice the way the air in the room had thickened heavy with the static charge of an approaching storm. Then the silence shattered. It wasn't the wail of police sirens that Richard was praying for. It was the shrill, demanding ringtone of his own cell phone vibrating violently against the polished mahogany table. Richard stopped mid-stride. He looked down at the screen, and a smug, greasy smile spread across his face, replacing the anxiety with a fresh wave of arrogance. He snatched up the device and held it up for the room to see, brandishing it like a weapon. "It is the director of the Sovereign Central Bank," he announced, his voice booming with self-importance. "He is calling to finalize the bridge loan for the merger. He is calling to congratulate us on the sale. Watch and learn, Alex. This is how the big boys play. This is what real power looks like." He swiped the screen and tapped the speakerphone icon, desperate for everyone, especially me, to hear his moment of triumph. George Richard barked, leaning over the table with a predator's grin. "Exquisite timing as always. We are just wrapping up the paperwork here. I assume you are calling to confirm the transfer of the acquisition funds." The voice that crackled from the speaker was not congratulatory. It was ice-cold, clipped and vibrating with a suppressed panic that instantly sucked the oxygen out of the room. "Richard, listen to me very carefully," the director said, his tone devoid of any pleasantries. "The transfer has been cancelled. The bridge loan is dead." Richard's smile faltered, twitching at the corners like a mask slipping. "Excuse me," he laughed, a high, nervous sound. "George, that is a very bad joke. We have a deal. The contracts are on the table." "It is not a joke," Richard the director snapped, his voice sharpening. "As of 2 minutes ago, every single credit line associated with the Harrington Group has been frozen. Your corporate accounts are locked. Your payroll accounts are suspended. Your international wire transfers have been flagged and halted. You are liquidating nothing. You are dead in the water." Richard turned the color of old paper. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as he stared at the phone in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "This is illegal. You cannot just shut us down. We are a solvent company. Who authorized this? I want names. I will have your job for this." "I cannot help you, Richard," the director replied, his voice dropping to a harsh, fearful whisper. "This did not come from the risk department. This came from the top. We received a direct, irrevocable standing order to freeze all assets pending a full forensic audit." Richard looked around the room, his eyes wild and searching. "From whom?" he shrieked, spit flying from his lips. "Who has the power to do that? Who did this to me?" The answer filled the room, echoing off the glass walls like a final judgment. "The order came from your majority shareholder," the director said. "It came from the owner of the controlling block, Mr. Alexander King." The name hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Alexander King. Richard froze. The phone slipped from his sweaty fingers and clattered onto the table, the line still open. He slowly lifted his head, his neck stiff with terror, and looked at me. He looked at the man sitting calmly in the chairman's seat, the man he had called a bum, the man whose name was Alex. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just leaned forward into the light, letting him see the absolute truth burning in my eyes. "Hello, Richard," I said softly. "Did you never wonder if Alex was short for Alexander?" His legs gave out. He slumped into the nearest chair, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. The arrogance was gone, vaporized in an instant. He wasn't looking at a pauper anymore. He was looking at Alexander King, the financial titan who had just turned off the lights on his entire world. Richard was a broken man slumped in his chair like a discarded puppet, but the real architect of this disaster was still standing. Bradley Harrington. He was gripping the edge of the table, his face pale, but his eyes still held a flicker of that old arrogance. He thought he could talk his way out of this. He thought he was smarter than the numbers. He believed that his title and his last name were shields that could deflect any arrow I threw at him. I turned away from the sobbing wreck of Richard and walked slowly toward the massive media wall that dominated the far end of the room. I didn't reach for a remote. I didn't press a button. I simply nodded to Blackwood. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, clinical light over the darkened boardroom. It wasn't a presentation on synergy or growth. It was a crime scene photo in digital form. The spreadsheet I had viewed in my truck was now 10 feet tall. Every row was a damning accusation. The unauthorized transfers, the Panama routing numbers, the final deposit into the Sovereign Bank of Zurich. $200 million. Stolen. Bradley looked at the screen and let out a scoff that sounded like a dying engine. "This is absurd," he declared, his voice shaking, just a little, forcing a smile that looked like a grimace. "You are twisting standard financial maneuvers, Alex. You simply do not understand high-level finance. Those are trust investments. They are offshore hedges designed to protect the pension fund from market volatility. I authorized them personally to save the employees. I am a hero, not a thief." I turned to face him. The audacity was almost impressive. He was lying to the man who owned the bank. He was lying to the man who had bought his debt. I leaned against the heavy table, crossing my arms. "You call it a hedge, Bradley," I said, my voice flat. "I call it grand larceny. And frankly, so do you." I tapped the surface of the smart table. The room filled with the sound of static, then clarity. It was a voice recording. It wasn't from a wiretap. It was from the security system I had installed in his own study months ago, a system he thought was for his protection, but was actually my witness. The audio was crystal clear. It was Bradley's voice, thick with scotch and satisfaction, speaking to his daughter just 12 hours ago. The pension fund is a piggy bank, Victoria, he said on the tape, his voice booming through the speakers, making everyone flinch. Who cares about the janitors? They will get a settlement. I took the 200 million because we deserve it. We need the villa in Como more than they need their heating bills paid. It is our money by right of blood. Let them starve. The recording cut off, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Victoria let out a small, strangled gasp. She looked at her father, not with love but with horror, realizing her diamond ring was bought with stolen retirement funds. Bradley opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The investment excuse died in his throat. He wasn't a savvy businessman protecting his workers. He was a thief caught on tape confessing to his crime. I walked closer until I was looming over him. That does not sound like a hedge, Bradley, I whispered. That sounds like a confession. And I am going to make sure the jury hears it in high definition. Bradley was a smoking ruin, a man whose reputation had been incinerated in less than 60 seconds, but the fire I had started was far from burning out. I turned my gaze from the father to the daughter. Victoria was pressing herself into the corner of the room, trying to make herself small, trying to disappear into the woodwork. She looked terrified, yes, but there was still a flicker of indignation in her eyes, a silent plea that said she was innocent, that she was just a child caught in the crossfire of men's wars. She truly believed that her hands were clean because she had never signed the checks. She was wrong. Her hands were filthy, stained with the ink of a corporate credit card that had been bleeding the company dry for years. I didn't speak to her immediately. I let the silence stretch heavy and accusatory. Then I snapped my fingers. The image on the massive media wall shifted again. Gone were the wire transfers and the Swiss bank accounts. In their place appeared a waterfall of credit card statements, thousands of lines of transactions scrolling down the screen at a dizzying speed. It was the expenditure log for the corporate black card issued to the office of the chairman's daughter. I walked over to the screen and tapped a specific section, freezing the scroll. The room gasped. It wasn't a list of business expenses. It was a catalog of gluttony. Let us talk about your contribution to the firm, Victoria. I said, my voice cutting through the room like a razor. You claimed to be the director of branding. You claimed you were revitalizing the company image. Let us look at the receipts. I pointed to a cluster of transactions dated just last month. Hermes, Hermes, Hermes. The list went on, a repetitive drumbeat of excess. 50 bags, I read aloud, letting the number hang in the air. 50 Birkin and Kelly bags purchased in Paris, London, and Milan over a period of 6 months. $300,000 of shareholder capital spent on leather and hardware. Were these for client gifts, Victoria? Were you bribing potential investors with handbags? Or is your closet simply more important than the payroll of the logistics department? She opened her mouth to protest, to stammer some excuse about image and expectations, but I didn't let her breathe. I swiped the screen again, bringing up the travel logs. And here we have the so-called strategy retreats, I continued, my voice dripping with disdain. The Maldives, the French Riviera, Aspen in peak season. You and your father billing the company for site inspections in places where we don't even have offices. I highlighted a single entry. A 2-week stay at the Four Seasons in Bora Bora. Cost to the company $80,000. Classification, urgent business development. Tell me, Victoria? I asked, leaning in close enough to see the panic dilating her pupils. What exactly were you developing in an overwater bungalow while the stock price was tanking? Was it synergy? Or was it a tan? The room, which had been paralyzed by shock, suddenly came alive. The minority shareholders, the board members who had been kept in the dark, the executives who had taken pay cuts to keep the lights on, they all started to murmur. The murmur grew into a growl. I heard the word thief whispered, then spoken louder. Someone at the back of the room, a man who had been with the company for 30 years, stood up and shouted, This is our money. That is our dividend. The booing started low, a rumble of collective outrage, and then it swelled. They weren't looking at a princess anymore. They were looking at a parasite. Victoria shrank back, clutching her chest, realizing that the admiration she thought she commanded was actually just tolerance for her father's power. And now that his power was gone, she was naked before them, exposed as nothing more than a spoiled child who had raided the treasury to play dress-up. I looked at her, seeing the tears welling up in her eyes. Tears not for her crimes, but for her humiliation. "You are not a victim, Victoria," I said, my voice cold and final. "You are an accomplice, and you are going to pay back every single cent, even if I have to sell those bags myself." The roar of the shareholders was deafening, a tidal wave of fury crashing against the walls of the boardroom. But I wasn't finished yet. I raised my hand, not in a fist, but with an open palm, demanding silence. It took a moment, but the noise died down, replaced by a heavy, expectant hush. They knew I had one more target. I turned slowly, deliberately, pivoting on my heel until I was facing Richard. He was slumped in his chair, his face slick with sweat, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped rat looking for a sewer grate. He had watched Bradley and Victoria fall, and he was trying to calculate his own survival odds. He licked his lips nervously and tried to straighten his tie, attempting to summon a shred of his former authority. "I did not touch the money," he blurted out, his voice cracking. "You can check the logs, Alex. I never touched the pension fund. I never used the corporate card. I am clean. You have nothing on me." I looked at him with a gaze so cold it could have frozen helium. "You are right, Richard," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You didn't steal money. You are too smart for petty theft. You didn't want a few $1,000,000 for handbags. You wanted the stock price to hit triple digits so you could cash out your options for $1 billion. And to do that, you didn't steal from the employees. You stole life." I signaled Blackwood. The screen behind me shifted one last time. The financial spreadsheets vanished. In their place appeared a series of medical charts, clinical trial data, and high-resolution images of pathology reports. The header on the documents read, "The Phoenix Protocol, Phase 3, Clinical Trials." Richard let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. You cannot show that he shrieked, jumping to his feet. "That is proprietary data. That is a trade secret. That is the future of oncology. It is not a cure." Richard Y roared, my voice thundering over his protests. "It is a death sentence." I pointed to the screen where a red line on a graph spiked dramatically upwards. "This is the mortality rate of the test group," I explained to the horrified room. "You claimed the Phoenix drug had a 90% efficacy rate in treating stage 4 lymphoma. You told the board, you told the investors, and you told the FDA that it was a miracle. But you lied." I swiped the screen, revealing the raw, unaltered data that Blackwood's team had extracted from the encrypted servers Richard thought were secure. The drug causes acute liver failure in 40% of patients. I read the statistics aloud, letting the horror sink in. "It doesn't shrink tumors, Richard. It shuts down organs. You knew this 6 months ago. The lead scientist sent you a warning. He told you the toxicity levels were lethal. He told you to halt the trial." I walked toward him until I was inches from his face, smelling the fear radiating off him. "And what did you do? Did you stop the trial? Did you save the patients? No. You fired the scientist. You buried the toxicity report. And you falsified the data to keep the stock price inflated long enough to sell the company to our competitor. You traded human lives for a quarterly earnings report." Richard was shaking his head violently, tears streaming down his face. No, that is not true. It was a statistical anomaly. We were going to fix it in Phase 4. We needed the funding. It was for the greater good." I pulled a single piece of paper from my pocket. It was a printout of an email Richard had sent to the lab director just 2 weeks ago. I held it up for the room to see. Subject line, "Problem resolution," I read. The body of the email says, if the FDA sees the liver failure data, the merger is dead. Delete the adverse event logs. Bury the bodies. We sell on Monday. The silence in the room was absolute. It wasn't the silence of shock anymore. It was the silence of a morgue. This wasn't embezzlement. This wasn't fraud. This was homicide. You aren't a businessman, Richard, I whispered, leaning in so only he could hear the final verdict. You are a butcher. And I haven't just called the police. I called the FBI. I called the FDA. And I called the press. Richard's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, sobbing into his hands. The shareholders stared at him with pure revulsion. I turned my back on him, adjusting my cuffs. The purge was complete. The rot had been exposed, and as the distant wail of sirens grew louder outside the building, I knew that the empire of lies had finally fallen. The silence in the room was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from the threads of their collective guilt. Richard was trembling, his face a mask of sheer panic, but the survival instinct of a cornered animal kicked in. He wiped the tears from his face with the back of his hand, smearing the expensive foundation he wore for television appearances. He wasn't ready to go to prison. He wasn't ready to lose. He stood up, his legs shaking, and looked around the table at the other board members, the silent men and women who had collected their fat checks for years while looking the other way. I call for a motion to adjourn, Richard shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. We need to assess these allegations privately. This meeting is compromised. I move to suspend all proceedings until legal counsel can review this fabricated evidence. All in favor of adjournment, raise your hands. It was a pathetic attempt to stop the bleeding, a frantic grasp for the emergency brake on a train that had already jumped the tracks. But fear is a powerful motivator. Slowly, hesitantly, hands began to rise around the table. First Bradley, then Victoria, followed by the CFO and the old guard directors, who knew that if I dug deep enough into their files, I would find their skeletons too. They looked at each other, finding courage in numbers. They were trying to use the bureaucracy that had protected them for decades to shield themselves one last time. Richard began to count, his confidence surging back with every raised hand. 7, 8, 9, 10. That is a majority, he declared, slamming his hand on the table. The motion carries. The meeting is adjourned. Security, clear the room. We will reconvene next week. He reached for his briefcase, his movements jerky and fast, ready to flee the building and probably the country before the FBI arrived. He thought he had found a loophole. He thought that the rules of Robert's Rules of Order still applied in a room where he had just been exposed as a monster. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I simply swiveled the massive leather chairman's chair slightly to the left, so I was facing the entire room. I raised my right hand. It wasn't a fist. It wasn't a wave. It was a single, open palm held high in the air. I veto, I said. The words were spoken with the volume of a normal conversation, but they hit the room like a thunderclap. Richard froze halfway to the door. He turned back slowly, a look of utter confusion on his face. You cannot veto, he spat. We have the majority. We have 10 votes. You are just one man. You lose. I lowered my hand slowly and looked him dead in the eye. You are still playing by the old rules, Richard. You are counting heads. I am counting equity. Blackwood stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Under the corporate bylaws of the Harrington Group Article 4 Section C, any shareholder possessing more than 50% of the voting stock retains absolute veto power over any board resolution, regardless of the head count. He gestured to me, a deferential nod to the new emperor. Mr. King holds 53% of the outstanding shares, Blackwood continued. The 10 people who raised their hands in this room collectively hold 17%. Your votes are mathematically irrelevant. You do not have a majority. You are guests in his house, and the master has spoken. The realization swept through the room like a cold wind. They looked at their hands, the hands they had raised in defiance, and realized they were holding nothing. Their power had evaporated. Their titles were meaningless. In the face of 53% democracy didn't exist. There was only the king. I stood up then. The chair rolled back with a soft hiss. I buttoned my jacket, smoothing the fabric over my chest. I looked at the faces around the table. The faces of the people who had sneered at me at Christmas parties, who had laughed at my cheap suits, who had helped Bradley and Richard loot the company I loved. This board is not adjourned, I said, my voice cold and hard as iron. This board is dissolved. I walked to the head of the table, standing right next to the trembling figure of Bradley. You are all fired, I announced, letting the words hang in the air. Every single one of you, effective immediately. You are terminated for cause. You will leave your company phones and your badges on this table. You will not return to your offices. You will not touch your computers. My security team will escort you to the lobby. I looked at Richard, who was now leaning against the wall for support, his face the color of ash. And Richard, I added softly, do not worry about finding a ride home. The federal agents waiting in the lobby will be more than happy to give you a lift. The room erupted into chaos, not of noise but of movement. Security moved in, efficient and silent, guiding the former masters of the universe toward the exit. I stood alone at the head of the table, watching them go, the silence returning to the room. But this time it was the silence of a clean slate. The purge was over. The rebuilding could begin. The security team had barely begun to herd the disgraced board members toward the doors when I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my personal laptop. It was a sleek, matte black machine, unbranded and modified for high-frequency trading. I placed it gently on the mahogany table right on top of the spilled champagne and the shattered glass. The sound of the lid opening was a soft click that echoed like the cocking of a pistol in the suddenly quiet room. Richard was still on the floor, clutching his briefcase to his chest as if it were a life raft. He looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen, confusion mixing with his terror. He didn't understand why I wasn't satisfied yet. He thought the firing was the end. He thought the FBI was the finale. He didn't realize that for a man like me, destroying a reputation is just sport. Destroying a fortune is art. I typed in my biometric key and the screen flared to life. I wasn't just logging into a brokerage account. I was accessing the direct market interface, the dark pools where the whales swim. I linked the laptop to the massive media wall behind me, overriding the medical charts with a live feed of the New York Stock Exchange ticker for the Harrington Group. Look at the screen, Richard, I said, my voice devoid of empathy. Look at the legacy you built. Right now it is trading at $140 a share. It is artificially inflated by your lies about the cancer drug and the rumors of the merger. It is a bubble. And I am holding the needle. I tapped a few keys, initiating a sequence I had coded weeks ago. It was a maneuver designed to trigger a cascading sell-off. I wasn't just selling my shares. I was dumping the float. I was flooding the market with so much supply that the algorithms would panic. Watch closely, I whispered. I hit the enter key. On the giant screen, the numbers flickered. For a second, nothing happened. Then the ticker flashed red. The price dropped to 130, then 120. The line on the graph didn't slope downward. It fell off a cliff. It was a vertical line of destruction. Richard scrambled to his knees, staring at the screen in horror. No, he screamed, clawing at the air. Stop it. You are killing it. You are wiping out the equity. My options. My margin accounts. That is the point, Richard, I replied, watching the numbers tumble. 100, 90, 80. I know you leveraged your personal holdings to buy that island in the Caribbean. I know you borrowed against your stock to pay off your gambling debts. You are fully exposed. His phone began to ring. Then it beeped. Then it rang again. It was his broker. It was the bank. It was the margin call. When the stock price hit $70, the automated systems at the lending houses triggered the liquidation of his personal assets. 50%, I narrated calmly, watching the wealth of a lifetime evaporate in seconds. You just lost half your net worth in 3 minutes. And we haven't even hit the bottom yet. The room was bathed in the red glow of the crashing market. Bradley was hyperventilating, clutching his chest as he watched his golden parachute turn into a lead anchor. Victoria was staring at the screen, her mouth open, unable to comprehend that the numbers represented her handbags, her vacations, her entire identity dissolving into pixels. $60, $50. The trading bells were ringing on the floor of the exchange, a chaotic symphony of panic. I sat there, the conductor of their ruin, watching the ticker bleed out. I wasn't just taking their jobs. I was ensuring that when they walked out of this building, they wouldn't be walking into a comfortable retirement. They would be walking into a world where they couldn't afford the gas to drive their luxury cars. I had turned their empire into dust, and I hadn't even broken a sweat. The chaos of the crashing stock market on the screen was suddenly drowned out by a sound far more terrifying than the ringing of trading bells. It was the heavy synchronized thud of boots hitting the marble floor of the corridor outside. The double doors, which had witnessed so much drama in the last hour, were kicked open with a force that splintered the frame. This was not a business meeting anymore. It was a raid. A phalanx of agents poured into the room, moving with the terrifying efficiency of a swarm. They wore navy blue windbreakers with 3 yellow letters emblazoned on their chests that spelled the end of the Harrington era. FBI. Behind them marched the grim-faced officers of the Economic Crimes Unit. The air in the boardroom shifted instantly from panic to absolute terror. They did not hesitate. They did not ask for permission. They moved straight through the debris of shattered glass and broken dreams, heading directly for the head of the table. 2 agents seized Bradley by the arms, hauling him out of his chair with a roughness that made him yelp in pain. He tried to pull away his expensive suit jacket, bunching up around his shoulders, stripping him of his last shred of dignity. "Bradley Harrington, you are under arrest for securities fraud, embezzlement, wire fraud, and racketeering." An agent barked, his voice cutting through Bradley's stammering protests. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was loud and metallic, a final definitive click that echoed off the glass walls. It was the sound of the cage door slamming shut. Bradley looked down at his wrists, staring at the steel that now bound him. His face went from pale to a mottled purple. The reality of prison, the reality of losing everything, cracked his mind wide open. He looked around the room, his eyes wild and desperate, searching for a scapegoat, searching for anyone to blame but himself. His gaze landed on Victoria. She was standing near the window, trembling, her hands covering her mouth, as she watched her father being restrained. She looked at him with tears in her eyes, expecting him to tell her it would be all right, expecting him to be the father who always fixed things. Instead, Bradley lunged toward her, straining against the grip of the agents. He bared his teeth in a snarl that was purely animalistic. It was her, he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. It was all her idea. She is the one who wanted the lifestyle. She is the one who demanded the villas and the diamonds. Look at her. Look at the ring on her finger. The agents held him back, but Bradley kept screaming, his voice shredding with hysteria. "I am an old man. I just wanted to retire. She pushed me. She told me we deserved it. She manipulated me. She said I was weak if I didn't take the money. Arrest her. She is the mastermind. She is the one who spent it all." Victoria took a step back as if he had physically struck her. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. This was the man who had bought her ponies and cars, the man she had idolized, the man she had defended just minutes ago. And now, to save his own skin, he was throwing her to the wolves without a second thought. He was rewriting history, painting his own daughter as a siren who had lured him onto the rocks of corruption. I watched from the other end of the table, impassive and cold. It was the final unveiling. The love in this family wasn't real. It was transactional. It existed only when the champagne was flowing and the accounts were full. The moment the pressure was applied, the bond shattered. Bradley wasn't protecting his child. He was offering her up as a sacrifice to the federal agents, hoping it would buy him leniency. The agents ignored his ranting, dragging him toward the door, but his screams lingered in the air, poisonous and vile. Victoria sank to the floor, her legs giving out under the weight of her father's betrayal. She looked at me across the room, her eyes hollow and broken, realizing that the monster wasn't the man who had just taken over her company. The monster was the man who had raised her. With Bradley being dragged, screaming from the room, the attention of the federal agents shifted instantly to the only target remaining: Richard. He was standing near the sideboard, clutching his chest, his face slick with a sheen of cold sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He watched the agents approach him, his eyes widening in terror as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. He looked at the handcuffs swinging from the belt of the lead officer, and he made a decision born of pure cowardice. He let out a strangled gasp, a theatrical sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. My heart. He wheezed, his voice trembling with a staged frailty. I can't breathe. It is my heart. He stumbled forward, knocking over a pitcher of water, sending it crashing to the floor. Then he collapsed. It wasn't a graceful fall. It was a heap of expensive fabric and flailing limbs hitting the carpet with a dull, heavy thud. He lay there, clutching his shirt, writhing in agony, his eyes rolling back in his head. Call an ambulance, someone shouted from the back of the room. He is having a heart attack. The federal agents hesitated. They were trained to deal with criminals, not medical emergencies. They stepped back, giving him space, uncertain if they were witnessing a tragedy or a farce. The room fell into a chaotic hush, the only sound being Richard's labored, ragged breathing and his low moans of pain. He was playing the victim one last time, trying to garner sympathy, trying to buy himself a ride to a hospital bed instead of a jail cell. I did not move from my spot at the head of the table. I did not reach for my phone. I did not look concerned. I looked at the man on the floor with the same detached interest I would show a bug that had flipped onto its back. I had anticipated every move. I knew these men better than they knew themselves. I knew that when cornered, a rat will play dead. I snapped my fingers, a sharp, crisp sound that cut through the murmurs of concern. From the shadows near the entrance, a figure emerged. It wasn't a paramedic. It was Dr. Vance, my private physician, a man I paid a retainer that could fund a small hospital. He was dressed in an immaculate suit, carrying a sleek medical bag. He walked through the confusion with the calm authority of a man who answers only to one person. Check him, I ordered, pointing to the writhing figure on the floor. Dr. Vance knelt beside Richard. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't ask where it hurt. He placed 2 fingers against the carotid artery on Richard's neck, his eyes fixed on his watch. Richard let out a loud groan, trying to intensify the performance, clutching at the doctor's sleeve. Help me, Richard, gasped, his voice thick with fake desperation. I am dying. Dr. Vance ignored him. He pulled a stethoscope from his bag and placed the cold metal against Richard's chest, listening intently for 10 seconds. Then he checked Richard's pupils, lifting the eyelids with a clinical indifference. He stood up slowly, dusting off the knees of his trousers. He turned to me and then to the federal agents. The room held its breath, waiting for the verdict. His pulse is steady at 72 beats per minute. Dr. Vance announced, his voice flat and bored. His pupils are reactive. His skin is warm and dry. There is no arrhythmia. There is no fibrillation. He looked down at Richard, who had suddenly stopped moaning. He is not having a heart attack, the doctor concluded. He is having a panic attack. And a very bad acting performance. The silence that followed was broken by a snort of laughter from one of the agents. Richard lay there on the floor, the ruse shattered, the sympathy evaporated. He looked up, realizing the game was up. He wasn't dying. He was just pathetic. The lead agent stepped forward, his face hard. "Get up, Richard," he barked. "The show is over." When Richard didn't move, the agents didn't wait. They reached down, grabbing him by the armpits, and hauled him to his feet with zero gentleness. His legs dragged uselessly for a moment before he found his footing. He wasn't clutching his chest anymore. He was clutching at the agents, begging them not to hurt him. It was a mistake, he sobbed, tears streaming down his face, real tears this time. "I was just following orders. It was Bradley. I will testify. I will tell you everything. Please do not put me in cuffs." I watched as they snapped the metal rings around his wrists. The man who had sneered at me, who had called me a bum, who had poisoned patients for profit, was now being dragged out of the room, weeping like a child. He looked at me one last time as they shoved him through the broken doors. He didn't see hatred in my eyes. He saw indifference. He was no longer an enemy. He was a memory. The boardroom was empty of traitors. I was alone at the top, and the view was spectacular. The gravel of the long, winding driveway crunched beneath the tires of the black SUV, but this time there was no valet waiting to open the door, and no feeling of inadequacy tightening my chest. I stepped out onto the cobblestones of the Harrington estate, the massive Georgian mansion looming above me like a fortress that had finally been breached. It used to look imposing, a monument to old money and untouchable power, but today, under the harsh glare of the midday sun, it just looked like a pile of expensive bricks waiting to be liquidated. I wasn't alone. I was accompanied by a squad of federal enforcement officers and a team of professional asset recovery specialists. They moved with a clinical efficiency, swarming up the steps and through the grand double doors, carrying clipboards, rolls of red adhesive tape, and packing crates. This wasn't a robbery. It was a repossession. It was the physical dismantling of a legacy built on theft. Inside the foyer, the air was stale and silent, stripped of the laughter and music that usually filled these halls. Standing at the foot of the sweeping staircase was Richard. He had made bail an hour ago, posting the deed to his Hampton summer house as collateral, not realizing that the title was already frozen. He looked like a ghost of the man who had screamed at me in the boardroom. He was wearing a wrinkled dress shirt, with the collar unbuttoned, his face unshaven and gray, his eyes hollow and red-rimmed. He stood there watching the movers handling his possessions with the detached numbness of a shock victim. He watched as a uniformed officer slapped a bright red sticker with a seizure number onto the base of a Ming vase that stood on the entryway table. Asset forfeiture number 409. Richard flinched as if the sticker had been applied to his own skin. He took a step forward, his hand raising weakly. "Please," he croaked, his voice a raspy whisper of its former boom. "Not the vase. That has been in the family for 3 generations. It is an heirloom." I walked over to him, when my footsteps echoing on the marble. I stood beside him, looking at the vase, then at the red tag that now defined its existence. It was an heirloom, Richard. I corrected him, my voice calm and devoid of pity. "Now it is restitution. It is a fraction of a % of the money you stole from the people who actually worked for a living." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a wet, pathetic pleading. "Alex, please. You have the company. You have the accounts. Leave us the house. Leave us our history. This is all we have left." I looked around the grand hall. I watched 2 movers carefully lift a massive oil painting from the wall, a 19th century landscape that Richard loved to brag about at dinner parties. They wrapped it in bubble wrap, extinguishing its beauty under layers of plastic. The wall behind it was left bare, revealing a rectangle of paint that was slightly brighter than the rest, a scar showing where the treasure had once been. "You do not have a history, Richard," I said, turning back to him. "You have a criminal record." Every chair in this house, every painting, every bottle of wine in the cellar was bought with dirty money. You didn't earn this lifestyle. You embezzled it. And now the bill has come due. I signaled to the lead enforcement officer who was holding a heavy inventory binder. Take it all I ordered. The art, the furniture, the rugs. If it isn't bolted to the floor, it goes into the truck. Leave them the mattresses and a coffee pot. Everything else is property of the creditors. Richard slumped against the banister, sliding down until he was sitting on the stairs, burying his face in his hands. He sobbed softly, the sound lost under the noise of packing tape and moving dollies. He was watching his identity being packed into boxes and carried away. He was watching his world turn into an empty echo. I turned and walked out the front door, leaving him alone in the hollow shell of his former glory. The mansion wasn't a home anymore. It was just another asset I had liquidated, and the silence it left behind was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the city streets into rivers of gray sludge, but Victoria didn't care about the weather. She only cared about the sanctuary of her penthouse. She stumbled out of the taxi, her designer heels slipping on the wet pavement, her hair plastered to her skull. She looked like a refugee from a destroyed kingdom, seeking asylum in the ivory tower she thought she still owned. She rushed toward the massive glass doors of the residence, clutching her platinum keycard like a holy relic. It was the key to her safe haven, the place where the world couldn't touch her, where the champagne was always cold and the sheets were always silk. She slapped the card against the black reader beside the door. She waited for the reassuring green light and the soft mechanical click of the lock disengaging. Instead, the reader let out a harsh, dissonant buzz and flashed a sharp, angry red. Denied. She frowned, wiping the rain from her eyes, and tried again. She rubbed the card on her coat, thinking the chip was wet. She pressed it harder against the plastic, as if she could force the electrons to obey her will. Buzz. Red light. Access denied. Open the door. She screamed, pounding her fist against the thick, reinforced glass. She could see the night concierge standing behind the marble desk inside. It was the same man who had carried her packages for 5 years, the man she had never tipped, and whose name she had never bothered to learn. He was standing there with his arms crossed, watching her struggle with the impassive expression of a stone gargoyle. He didn't rush to help her. He didn't smile. He picked up a radio, spoke a few words, and then walked slowly toward the entrance. He didn't open the door for her. He opened the side service door, the one used for deliveries and trash. He stepped out into the rain, dragging 2 large suitcases behind him. They were her suitcases, the vintage Louis Vuitton trunks she used for her weekend getaways. He didn't hand them to her. He shoved them. The expensive leather skidded across the wet concrete, coming to a rest in a puddle of dirty water. Victoria stared at her luggage, then at the man she used to treat like furniture. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "Take those back inside. I live in the penthouse. Open the door right now, or I will have you fired before your shift ends." The guard looked at her, and for the first time she saw the contempt he had been hiding for years. "You do not live here anymore, Ms. Harrington," he said, his voice flat and heavy. "Your lease has been terminated, effective immediately. The locks have been changed. The codes have been wiped. That is impossible," she spat. "My father owns this unit. Nobody kicks me out." "Correction," he replied, a small, satisfied smile touching his lips. "Your father used to own this unit. The building was sold this afternoon. The entire property portfolio was liquidated to cover the debt." Victoria froze, the rain running down her face, masking her tears. "Sold? To whom? Who is doing this?" The guard took a step back, retreating into the warmth of the lobby, preparing to close the door on her world forever. "The new owner left specific instructions," he said. "He said that tenants with a history of theft and vandalism are not welcome. He said you are banned from the premises permanently." He reached for the handle. "Wait," Victoria begged, grabbing the edge of the door, her arrogance finally drowning in desperation. "Who is the new owner? Tell me his name." The guard looked at her one last time before sealing the tomb. "Mr. King," he said. The door clicked shut. The lock engaged. Victoria was left standing alone in the rain, staring at her reflection in the glass, surrounded by her soaked luggage, realizing that the street was the only home she had left. The rain was a cold shroud, wrapping around her shivering frame as she dragged her heavy suitcases down the cracked sidewalk of the old neighborhood. It was a part of the city she had sworn never to visit again, a place of peeling paint and broken streetlights, where the air smelled of exhaust and desperation. This was where Alex had lived when they first met. This was the hole he had crawled out of to marry her. For years, she had mocked this place, using it as a weapon to remind him of his inferiority. Now it was her only destination. It was the only place left on earth where a door might still open for her. She climbed the concrete steps, her expensive heels clicking unevenly on the chipped stone. Her mind was racing, spinning a new web of lies and manipulation. She convinced herself that the man who had destroyed her father in the boardroom was just an act. She told herself that deep down the old Alex was still there, buried under the anger. The Alex who looked at her with puppy dog eyes. The Alex who would do anything for a smile. She would cry. She would tell him she was a victim of her father's cruelty. She would play the damsel in distress, and he would have to save her. He was weak. He loved her. He would take her back. She reached the 4th floor out of breath, her hair plastered to her skull. She stood before the door of apartment 4B. It looked just as she remembered it. The paint was a faded industrial green, chipping away to reveal rusted metal underneath. The number was crooked, hanging by a single screw. It was the entrance to a life of poverty she had despised, but now it looked like salvation. She raised her hand to knock, preparing her face into a mask of tragic beauty, but her knuckles never touched the wood. The door swung inward, with a silent, well-oiled smoothness that felt wrong. It wasn't the creaky, rusty hinge she remembered. It glided open, inviting her into the darkness. "Alex," she called out, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. "Alex, are you there? It is me. Please, I have nowhere else to go." She stepped across the threshold, dragging her luggage behind her, expecting to smell the stale odor of instant noodles and cheap laundry detergent. She expected to see the sagging sofa, the water-stained ceiling, and the small television sitting on a milk crate. She expected the cage of a poor man. Instead, she stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click, locking out the noise of the street. She wasn't standing in a tenement apartment. She was standing in a command center. The interior walls had been gutted. The rotting drywall and water-damaged plaster were gone, replaced by sleek, soundproof panels of matte charcoal. The cheap linoleum floor had been ripped up, revealing polished concrete that gleamed under the soft, ambient lighting, hidden in the ceiling coves. The air was cool and crisp, filtered by a high-end purification system that erased the stench of the building outside. There was no clutter. There were no dirty dishes. In the center of the room sat a single desk made of black glass, minimalist and severe. Behind it, a wall of monitors flickered with data streams, live feeds from the stock exchange, and security camera footage from the Harrington estate. It was a fortress hidden in plain sight. Victoria walked to the center of the room, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. She ran her hand over the cold surface of the desk. There was no dust. It was impeccable. She looked around, realizing with a sickening jolt that Alex hadn't lived here in squalor. He had used this place as a base of operations. While she was mocking him for being poor, he was sitting in this room surrounded by technology worth millions, orchestrating the downfall of her entire family. He wasn't a victim surviving in a dump. He was a spider sitting in the center of a web he had built right under her nose. The apartment wasn't a home. It was a blind. And it was empty. He wasn't there. He had never really been there. She was standing in the ghost of the man she thought she knew, realizing that she had been sleeping next to a stranger for 5 years. The silence of the command center was broken by a low, hydraulic hiss that sounded like the airlock of a spacecraft. Victoria jumped, spinning around, as the matte charcoal wall at the far end of the room began to move. It didn't swing open like a door. It retracted, sliding seamlessly into the ceiling to reveal what lay beyond. It was a passage not to another cramped room, but to another world entirely. She stepped through the opening, her heels sinking into plush, hand-woven silk carpet that felt like walking on clouds. The air here smelled different. It smelled of white tea and old money. She found herself standing on the mezzanine level of a 3-story atrium that defied the physics of the neighborhood outside. The old tenement building was just a shell, a hollow facade designed to fool the world. Alex had bought the luxury skyscraper next door and broken through the firewall, fusing the two structures together to create a palace in the sky that remained invisible from the street. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a 360-degree view of the city, rain-lashed and glittering below. A massive chandelier made of 3,000 Swarovski crystals hung from the vaulted ceiling, suspended like a frozen waterfall of light. To her left, a floating staircase made of glass and polished steel spiraled down to a living area vast enough to host a state dinner. There were original Banksys on the walls, a grand piano that had once belonged to a rock legend, and furniture that looked like modern art sculptures. It was a display of wealth so staggering it made her father's mansion look like a dollhouse. Victoria walked to the railing, her breath fogging the glass. She looked down and saw him. Alex was standing by the fireplace on the lower level, swirling a glass of rare amber liquid. He had taken off his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing the Patek Philippe that caught the firelight. He looked at ease, the absolute master of his domain. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the flames dance. She descended the stairs, her legs trembling uncontrollably. Every step was a painful reminder of what she had thrown away. She had traded this emperor for a thief. She had traded a man who could give her the universe for a father who used her as a human shield. She reached the bottom floor, the sound of her own ragged breathing loud in her ears. "Alex," she whispered, her voice cracking. He turned slowly. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes traveling over her soaked clothes and her ruined makeup. He didn't offer her a towel. He didn't offer her a drink. He looked at her as if she were a stranger who had wandered into a private museum. "You are not supposed to see this," he said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "This was my sanctuary, the one place your greed could not touch." Victoria let out a sob, a raw, ugly sound of pure regret. She ran across the room, closing the distance between them, but she stopped a few feet away, halted by the icy wall of his indifference. She looked at the luxury around her, then back at his cold blue eyes. The reality of her loss crushed her. She didn't just lose a husband. She lost the winning lottery ticket. "I didn't know," she cried, dropping to her knees on the cold marble floor. "Alex, please. I was scared. My father forced me. He threatened me. I never stopped loving you. I only did what I had to do to survive." She crawled forward, reaching for his hand, clutching the hem of his trousers like a beggar pleading for bread. "Look at all this, Alex," she pleaded, gesturing frantically at the room, her eyes wide and manic. "We can share it. We can start over. I will be the wife you wanted. I will be perfect. Just don't throw me out. Don't make me leave. I have nothing. I am nothing without you." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rain, waiting for him to reach down and pull her up, waiting for the savior she had despised to rescue her one last time. She offered him her complete submission, hoping it was enough to buy back the life she had destroyed. I sat back into the deep curves of the Italian leather sofa, letting the butter-soft material hold me. It was a masterpiece of comfort, designed for a man who had nothing left to prove. I took another sip of my drink, swirling the amber liquid in the heavy crystal glass, watching the woman, who had vowed to be my partner for life, sobbing on the cold, hard floor. She looked small from this angle. The grandeur of the room swallowed her whole, making her tears seem insignificant. She was weeping for the loss of a lifestyle she felt entitled to, not for the loss of the man she had betrayed. "Victoria," I said, my voice cutting through her sobs like a knife through silk. "Stop!" She looked up, her face a mess of smeared mascara and red blotchy skin. She reached out her hand, trembling, trying to touch the hem of my trousers, trying to bridge the gap between her ruin and my success. She was looking at the Patek Philippe on my wrist, not at the scars on my soul. "You said you loved me," she choked out, her voice thick with desperation. "You said we were forever. You promised to take care of me." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, staring deep into her eyes. I was looking for the woman I met in the rain 5 years ago, but she wasn't there. Maybe she never was. All I saw was a reflection of my own foolishness. "I did love you," I replied quietly. "I loved you enough to save your father from prison 3 years ago without taking credit. I loved you enough to hide my wealth so we could build something real, something that wasn't defined by bank accounts. But you didn't love me, Victoria. You loved the potential of me. You loved the idea of a safety net." I stood up, walking over to the fireplace, turning my back on hers. The heat of the fire felt good against the chill she had brought into the room. "When you thought I was poor, you treated me like a disease." I continued, watching the flames lick the logs. "You punished me for not giving you the world you thought you deserved. You slept in my bed and dreamed of escaping. You mocked me to your friends. You let your father spit on me. And now that you see the palace, you suddenly remember the love." I turned back to face her, my expression hardening into stone. "That is not love, Victoria. That is investment strategy. And you made a bad bet." She tried to stand up, her legs shaking. "Alex, please. I can change. I can learn. We have money now. We can be happy. I will sign a prenup. I will do anything." I laughed, a short, humorless sound that echoed off the high ceiling. "That is the tragedy of it all. You are right. There is money. There is more money in this room than your father ever stole in his entire miserable life. I have fleets of jets. I have islands. I have the power to buy anything on this earth." I walked closer until I was towering over her, letting her feel the full weight of my presence. "But you do not have the standing to spend a single dime of it. You are bankrupt, Victoria. Not financially, but morally. You overplayed your hand. You showed me your soul, and it was empty. You wanted a king, but you treated me like a jester. Now the king is here, and you are not welcome in his court." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a sleek black remote. I pressed a single button. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator slid open with a soft chime. 2 members of my personal security detail stepped out. They weren't the police. They were my men paid to keep the trash out of my sanctuary. "Remove her," I ordered, pointing to the weeping woman on the floor. "She is trespassing." Victoria screamed as they grabbed her arms. "No, Alex, no. You cannot do this. I am your wife." "Ex-wife," I corrected her as they dragged her toward the elevator. "My lawyers filed the papers this morning. You get nothing. You have nothing." I watched as they hauled her into the elevator car. She reached out one last time, her fingers clawing at the air, her eyes wide with the realization that she had touched paradise and been cast out. The doors began to close, cutting off her screams. I watched until the sliver of light vanished, leaving me alone in the silence of my victory. I turned back to the window, looking out at the city lights. It was lonely at the top, but the air was clean, and for the first time in 5 years, I could finally breathe. 3 months have passed since the gavel fell and the heavy steel doors of the federal penitentiary slammed shut behind the men who once thought they owned the skyline. The world outside has moved on. The stock market has corrected itself. The company is under new management, and the employees have their pensions back. But inside the concrete belly of the correctional facility, time moves differently. It drags its feet heavy and suffocating, stripping away the layers of pretense until only the raw, ugly truth remains. Bradley has not adjusted well to his new reality. He walked in on the first day with his chin held high, treating the guards like doormen and the other inmates like employees he could fire. He demanded a private cell. He complained about the thread count of the sheets. He tried to bribe the warden with assets that had already been seized. He never understood that in here his net worth is zero and his attitude is a liability. Yesterday, that arrogance finally cost him more than just his dignity. He made the mistake of cutting in line in the cafeteria loudly, proclaiming that a man of his stature should not have to wait for slop. He insulted a man serving life for violent crimes, calling him a peasant. The response was immediate and brutal. There were no lawyers to object. There was no security team to intervene. Just the sickening sound of a plastic tray hitting the floor, followed by the crunch of bone against concrete. Now Bradley sits in the corner of the medical ward, his face a swollen map of purple and blue. His nose is broken, a jagged line that ruins his aristocratic profile. He is missing 2 front teeth. He whimpers when he moves, clutching his ribs, terrified of the shadows. The wolf of the boardroom has become the sheep of the cell block. He has learned the hard way that respect in here is earned with blood, not bought with stolen money. In the cell next door, Richard is undergoing a different kind of disintegration. If you looked at him now, you would not recognize the polished executive who sipped champagne and laughed at the poor. He has aged 20 years in 90 days. His hair, once dyed and perfectly coiffed, is now a wild shock of thinning white. His skin is gray and papery, hanging loosely on a frame that has wasted away. He spends his days sitting on the edge of his bunk, staring at the blank concrete wall, rocking back and forth with a hypnotic rhythm. He talks to people who are not there. He holds invisible meetings, conducting business with ghosts. "We need to diversify the portfolio," he mutters, his voice a dry rasp. "Tell the broker to sell. Liquidate the assets. The market is crashing." He mimes signing documents with a shaking hand, using a phantom pen on the empty air. He laughs at jokes no one told. He screams at subordinates who exist only in his fractured mind. The prison psychiatrist calls it a dissociation break, a retreat from a reality too painful to accept. He is living in a loop of his glory days, unaware that he is wearing a jumpsuit with a number on the chest. He is a king in his own head, ruling over an empire of dust and silence. I received a report from the warden this morning. He told me that when they pass each other in the yard, they do not speak. They do not look at each other. The shame is too great. The mirror of their failure is too clear. They are together in hell, but they are utterly alone. The golden parachutes didn't open. They hit the ground, and they are still falling. The biting wind of the early morning whipped around the corner of the skyscraper, cutting through the thin fabric of the gray polyester jumpsuit that hung loosely on Victoria's frame. It was a uniform that smelled permanently of ammonia and cheap industrial soap, a scent that had seeped into her pores and replaced the delicate floral perfumes she used to wear. She dipped her sponge into the bucket of freezing gray water, her hands raw and chapped the once perfect manicure, now a distant memory of a life she had forfeited. She shivered not just from the cold, but from the crushing weight of her new reality. She raised the squeegee to the massive pane of glass, dragging it down in a long, rhythmic stroke. She was cleaning the main entrance of the Harrington Tower. The irony was a physical weight on her shoulders. This was the building where she used to walk through the doors like a princess, where the staff would scramble to open the way for her, where she would complain if the floor wasn't polished to a mirror shine. Now she was the one polishing the glass, invisible to the executives who rushed past her, talking into their headsets, their eyes fixed on horizons she could no longer see. She wasn't in prison. The prosecutors had decided she was a minor player, a pawn manipulated by her father and husband. They stripped her of her assets, seized her accounts, and left her with nothing but her freedom and a mountain of debt. She had no skills, no references, and a last name that was now synonymous with fraud. This job was the only thing standing between her and the homeless shelter. A commotion at the curb snapped her out of her misery. The heavy thud of a car door closing echoed against the stone facade. She turned her head, pressing her forehead against the cold glass she had just cleaned. A sleek midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom had pulled up to the curb. It was a machine of pure power and elegance gleaming under the streetlights like a dark jewel. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. A man emerged. Victoria froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was Alex. But it wasn't the Alex she remembered. It wasn't the man who wore ill-fitting shirts and looked at her with adoration. This was a titan. He was wearing a navy suit that fit him like a second skin, the fabric moving with him as he stepped onto the pavement. He looked taller, broader, and infinitely more dangerous. He exuded an aura of absolute command, a gravitational pull that drew the eyes of everyone on the street. He paused for a moment, adjusting his cufflinks, the gold catching the morning light. He looked up at the building, at the empire he had conquered. His expression was calm, unreadable. He wasn't gloating. He was simply existing in a world he owned. Victoria stood on the other side of the glass, a ghost in a gray jumpsuit holding a dripping sponge. She wanted to run. She wanted to hide. But she couldn't move. She was paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what she had lost. She looked at his shoes, polished Italian leather sheer that cost more than she would earn in a year of scrubbing floors. She looked at his face, the face she had kissed, the face she had lied to, the face she had betrayed. For a split second, Alex's gaze drifted toward the entrance. He looked through the glass. His eyes met hers. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. She waited for a reaction, a frown, a sneer, a look of pity. She waited for him to acknowledge her existence, to acknowledge their past. But he didn't. His eyes slid over her as if she were part of the architecture, as if she were a smudge on the window that someone else would deal with. There was no recognition. There was no hate. There was only total, absolute indifference. To him, she wasn't Victoria Harrington anymore. She was just a cleaner. He turned away, focusing on his phone, and walked through the revolving doors flanked by his security team. The glass barrier spun, separating them once again. He walked into the warmth, into the light, into the power. She remained outside in the cold, clutching her squeegee, staring at the back of the man who could have given her the world if only she had been decent enough to deserve it. She looked at her reflection in the window he had just walked through. A tired, broken woman stared back. She dipped her sponge into the dirty water and went back to work. The glass doors of the executive suite slid open, with a hushed whisper revealing a woman who looked as though she was walking to her own execution. Emily stepped onto the plush carpet, clutching her handbag with white-knuckled intensity. She was wearing a suit that she had likely bought off the rack at a department store sale, a stark contrast to the couture that used to parade through these halls. Her shoes were sensible and scuffed at the toes, worn down by months of pounding the pavement, looking for work in a city that had blacklisted her. She stopped in the center of the room, her eyes darting around nervously. She expected to see Bradley screaming at her, or Victoria mocking her hair. She still carried the trauma of the day she was fired 2 years ago. I remembered it vividly. She had been the only person in the finance department brave enough to question a discrepancy in the pension fund. For her honesty, she was escorted out by security, labeled a troublemaker, and stripped of her severance. She had lost her apartment. She had moved back in with her parents. She had been erased. I stood by the window watching the city traffic far below. When I turned, she flinched. She didn't see the Wolf of Wall Street. She saw the man who used to bring her coffee when everyone else treated her like furniture. "Alex," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I mean, Mr. King, I received your message. If this is about the old audit logs, I swear I didn't keep any copies. I don't want any trouble." I walked over to the desk, the massive slab of oak that Bradley had used as a barricade against reality. I didn't sit behind it. I sat on the edge, crossing my arms and looking at her with a warmth that had been absent from my eyes for months. "You are not in trouble, Emily," I said softly. "You are the only person who isn't." I reached out and picked up a heavy crystal paperweight, turning it over in my hands. "I remember the day they fired you. I remember you crying in the elevator, not because you lost your paycheck, but because you were worried about the employees losing their savings. You were the only one in this entire building who cared more about the people than the profit." She looked down at her shoes, ashamed of a virtue that had cost her everything. "I was stupid," she murmured. "I should have kept my mouth shut." "No," I corrected her, stepping forward. "You were moral. And in the world I am building, morality is the most valuable currency." I gestured to the empty chair behind the desk, the leather seat that still bore the imprint of tyrants. "This company has been poisoned by bloodlines." I continued, my voice firm and resonant. "It was destroyed by people who thought their last name gave them the right to rule. They thought power was an inheritance. They were wrong. Power is a responsibility, and it belongs to those who have earned it through sweat and integrity." I picked up a single file from the desk and held it out to her. It wasn't a job offer for a secretary. It was the contract for the chief executive officer. "I am not looking for an assistant, Emily. I have plenty of those. I am looking for a CEO." Her eyes went wide, disbelief washing over her face. She stepped back, shaking her head. "Me. But Alex, I am nobody. I don't have the pedigree. I don't have the connections." "Exactly," I said, placing the file in her trembling hands. "That is exactly why you are perfect. You know what it feels like to be powerless. You know the value of $1. You will not steal from the janitor because you know the janitor's name. You will not crash the company for a bonus because you know the cost of unemployment." I walked past her, heading toward the door. I paused with my hand on the frame, looking back at her standing in the center of the room, holding her future in her hands. "The office is yours, Emily. Change the locks. Change the culture. And if anyone asks you why you are sitting in that chair, tell them that the king does not believe in heirs. He believes in survivors." I walked out into the hallway, leaving her alone in the seat of power. For the first time in the history of the Harrington Group, the person at the top wasn't a shark. She was a human being. And that was the greatest victory of all. The wind up here was savage, a constant reminder that at this altitude the air is thin and the drop is lethal. I leaned against the glass railing of the rooftop terrace, looking down at the sprawling grid of the city. From this height, the cars looked like blood cells moving through the arteries of a beast I had finally tamed. The lights of the skyline shimmered like diamonds scattered on black velvet, but they no longer dazzled me. I owned the lights now. I owned the power that kept them burning. I took a deep breath, letting the cold night air fill my lungs. It tasted different than it did yesterday. It didn't taste like smog or exhaust. It tasted like oxygen. It tasted like survival. I thought about the man I was 5 years ago. The boy who sat at the dinner table and swallowed insults like they were medicine. The husband who apologized for existing. The son-in-law who tried to buy love with secret billions. That man was dead. He had died in the boardroom, buried under the weight of his own naivety. People always ask what it feels like to be a billionaire. They want to know about the jets, the islands, the supercars. They think the money is the prize. They think that looking at a bank balance with 10 zeros is the definition of success. They are wrong. I looked down at my hands. They were the same hands that had gripped the steering wheel of a rusted truck. They were the same hands that had signed the termination orders. Money is just a tool. It is a hammer. You can use it to build a shelter, or you can use it to break a window. I had used it to break a prison. The greatest luxury isn't the Patek Philippe on my wrist, or the penthouse suite behind me. It isn't the ability to buy a company before breakfast. The true wealth, the only wealth that actually matters, is the freedom to identify the poison in your life and cut it out. It is the power to look at the people who drain your spirit, who mock your dreams, who use you as a stepping stone and remove them from your existence without hesitation. I didn't buy happiness. I bought a scalpel, and I used it to carve out the rot that had been killing me for years. Bradley, Richard, Victoria. They weren't family. They were a disease. And now I was finally cured. The silence up here was profound. There was no more screaming, no more fake laughter, no more lies, just the wind and the hum of the city below. The Harringtons were gone footnotes in a ledger I had already closed. They were the price of admission to this new life. They thought they were the kings and queens of this world, but they were just squatters in my palace. I turned away from the edge, catching my reflection in the dark glass of the terrace doors. I didn't see a victim anymore. I didn't see a survivor. I saw a conqueror. The past was a lesson written in scars. The present was a victory written in ink. But the future was an empire waiting to be built. I adjusted my jacket, straightening the lapels. The night was young. The markets in Tokyo were just opening. There were other companies to save other monsters, to fight other worlds to conquer. I walked toward the doors, ready to step back into the light. My name is Alexander King, and the game has only just begun. We spend our lives chasing numbers, believing that a higher balance equals a better existence. But I learned the hard way that true power is not about what you can buy, it is about what you can refuse. It is the strength to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. The Harringtons had millions, yet they were spiritually bankrupt. I had nothing, yet I possessed the integrity they lacked. Never let anyone measure your worth by the weight of your wallet, because your dignity is the only asset that never depreciates, and protecting it is the only investment that truly pays off. If you believe in the power of resilience and justice, hit that subscribe button and join me for the next chapter.